Chapter 1, Time Breaks Open The Time Engine Part 1, The Invention I. Introduction. The man had a gift for ideas, not the polished, presentable kind that look good in journals or get applause at the Royal Society. The other kind, the dangerous kind. Ideas that arrived at 3 in the morning with the force of a physical blow that made you sit up in the dark with your heart hammering, certain that you'd either discovered something profound or lost your mind entirely. We called him the Time Traveler. That wasn't his name doesn't matter, but after everything that happened, it's the only name that fits. His house sat on the edge of Richmond, a Victorian pile of brick and ambition, always slightly too warm from the coal furnaces he ran in the basement. The laboratory occupied 3 rooms on the ground floor, filled with equipment that smelled of hot metal and ozone. Gears the size of dinner plates, crystal rods that caught the gaslight and scattered it into spectra across the ceiling, things that hummed at frequencies that made your back teeth ache. Thursday evenings were his dinners, the same crowd more or less, Philby with his argumentative red hair, the medical man always slightly distracted, always fingering something in his coat pocket, the psychologist, who considered himself the most rational person in any room, the editor, the journalist, me the narrator of this whole impossible business, though I didn't know that yet. We came because the food was good and because he made us think, made us uncomfortable in the way that real thinking tends to do. That particular Thursday evening he was late to his own dinner. We'd already moved through the soup when he appeared in the doorway. Something was wrong with him. Not wrong in a medical sense, wrong in the way that a man looks when the world has done something to him that the world isn't supposed to be able to do. His coat was torn at the shoulder. His trousers were stained with something dark and dried. His face had the hollow, overbright quality of a man running on fumes and adrenaline and whatever stubborn fire lives in the center of a person who refuses to stop moving. He walked to his chair without speaking. He sat down. He poured himself a glass of claret and drained it. "What in God's name?" Philby started. The Time Traveler held up one hand. Philby went quiet. We all went quiet. There was something in that gesture, a kind of authority that comes not from rank but from experience, the look of a man who has seen things that render small social courtesies completely irrelevant. "Let me eat," he said. "Then I'll tell you everything." His voice was steady. That was almost the most disturbing thing. Whatever had happened to him, whatever had torn his coat and hollowed his eyes and left those dark stains on his trousers, he'd made peace with it already, or reached a kind of truce. We ate. Nobody spoke much. The lamb was excellent. The silence was not. When the plates were cleared, he looked around the table at each of us in turn, measuring us, deciding something. "A week ago," he said, "I sat in this same chair." He paused. "And that's the last thing I did in this century." The week before that previous Thursday had been different. That evening he'd summoned us to the laboratory before dinner. Not the dining room, not the drawing room, the laboratory. We'd crowded in between the workbenches, the psychologist nearly knocking over a brass instrument whose function none of us could have named, the medical man studying a crystal assembly with the cautious interest of a man who knows enough physics to be worried. The Time Traveler stood at the center of the room like a conductor waiting for silence. "Gentlemen," he said, "what do you understand about time?" Philby opened his mouth. "Rhetorical question," the Time Traveler said. He picked up a small, elegant object from the nearest workbench and held it up. Ivory and crystal and something darker, nickel maybe, or some alloy none of us recognized. It was beautiful in the way that precise instruments are beautiful. All function and no waste. It sat comfortably in his palm. It weighed, I would later learn, almost nothing. "You understand space," he said. "You navigate 3 dimensions every moment of your waking life without thinking about it. Length, breadth, height." He set the object down and picked up a piece of chalk, moved to the blackboard, drew 3 intersecting lines, 3 axes, 3 freedoms of movement. "You accept this without question." He turned back to face us. "You are wrong to stop at 3. The psychologist made a small, skeptical sound. The Time Traveler ignored him. "A cube," he said, drawing one quickly, his chalk moving with the fluency of a man who'd written this on this board 100 times for himself alone at 2 in the morning. "It has length, breadth, thickness. It exists in 3 dimensions, but," he tapped the chalk against his palm, "does it exist instantaneously?" Silence. "No," he said, "it cannot. Any real object must endure for some period of time. It must have extension in the 4th dimension, time." He wrote the word on the board, underlined it twice. "Time is simply another dimension of space. It is the direction in which things endure, and like any dimension," he paused, let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "It can be traversed." The medical man said, "You're claiming you can move through time, deliberately, under control." "I'm claiming it's possible in principle," the Time Traveler said. "I'm about to demonstrate it in practice." "A model," the psychologist said. The skepticism in his voice was a living thing, a functioning prototype. He gestured at the small ivory and crystal object. We all looked at it. It sat there on the workbench, innocent and intricate, throwing tiny reflections of the gas jets across the ceiling. The machine operates on principles that will take me an hour to explain fully, he said, and which I will explain tonight after dinner if you're still interested. For now, observe. He reached out and touched one of the levers, just the lightest touch. The machine vanished, not quickly, not with a bang or a flash of light. It simply became less present, flickered like a candle in a draft, and then there was nothing on the workbench but the outline of where it had sat. A faint impression of its weight still visible in the leather mat beneath. The psychologist made a sound that was not in any way skeptical. "Where did it go?" the medical man said. When the time traveler corrected, he was smiling. He looked like a man who has spent years alone with a secret and has finally found the moment to share it. The question isn't where, it's when. He had worked on this for 3 years. 3 years of Thursdays and all the days in between. 3 years of coal and gaslight and burned fingers and failed calculations that outnumbered the successful ones by a ratio he didn't like to admit. 3 years of being the man in the room that other men weren't sure about. Brilliant. Obviously, everyone agreed on brilliant, but stable. That was the polite question nobody asked directly. The physics of it. As he explained it that evening with all of us leaning forward over our after-dinner port, an object moving through time experiences the same fundamental relationship to the fourth dimension that an object moving through space experiences to the other three. There is resistance. There is a medium to move through. The medium of time is not empty, it has, for want of a better word, texture. The machine exploited that texture. The quartz rods were accumulators. The nickel framework was both structure and antenna. The crystal assembly, the thing that had made the medical man nervous, was the interface between the machine's mechanical reality and the temporal medium it needed to penetrate. "Think of it like a ship's hull," the time traveler said. "The hull doesn't understand water. It doesn't need to. It's simply shaped in such a way that water must move around it. The machine is shaped in a mathematical sense. A geometric sense such that time must move around it, or rather such that the machine can move through time the way a ship moves through water. And the operator, the psychologist, said his skepticism had not recovered. The person sitting in the machine moves with it." He paused. "That's the part I haven't been entirely certain about." The word entirely landed in the room like a dropped coin. "You haven't tested it," Philby said. "I've tested the model, as you saw. You haven't tested it with a person inside it." The time traveler looked at him. There was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read. Not recklessness exactly, not foolishness. Something more like the look of a man who has run the calculations and accepted the odds and decided that the thing on the other side of the risk is worth it. "Not yet," he said. Second. The machine, the full machine, was in the laboratory annex. He took us through after the small one had appeared again, 30 minutes after it vanished. It had simply resolved back into existence on the workbench, cold to the touch, carrying a faint smell of ozone and something sweeter that none of us could identify, and the sight of it stopped all conversation. It was beautiful, that's the only word. It occupied the center of the room like a piece of sculpture or an altar or something between the two. The ivory of the working parts had yellowed slightly with age and handling. The nickel gleamed under the gas jets. The quartz rods caught the light and held it suspended the way water holds light underwater. There was a padded seat, leather, the same dark brown as old books. There were 2 levers set within easy reach, one lever for the future, one for the past. "You sit here," the time traveler said, touching the seat. "You push this lever forward to move into the future. Pull this one back to return." He said it the way a man describes a train timetable, simple, inevitable. The machine accelerates through time the way a locomotive accelerates through distance. The faster you go, the faster the world outside changes. "What do you see?" I asked. "While it's moving," he looked at me. Something shifted in his expression, and for just a moment before the composure reassembled itself, I saw something raw underneath. Not fear exactly. Something that fear might become if it had been examined long enough to be understood. "Night and day," he said, cycling, faster and faster until they blur into a kind of continuous half-light. The sun arcing across the sky like a pendulum, the moon following, seasons visible in the garden if you're watching, the snow and the melt and the growth all compressed into flickers. He paused, "And you are completely alone. Surrounded by motion that nothing alive could survive outside the machine, sitting perfectly still in the middle of a storm of time." Nobody spoke. "It is," he said quietly, "the most extraordinary thing I have ever experienced." And then he smiled, and the moment passed, and he was himself again, precise, animated, spilling over with the need to explain, to share. To make us understand what he'd found in that basement room after 3 years of burning through coal and calculations. But I remembered that moment, the rawness under the composure. I remembered it later when I understood what it had cost him. Third, the time traveler returns back to the present Thursday, back to the man at the dinner table with the torn coat and the hollow eyes and the dried stains on his trousers that might have been soil or might have been blood. He told us to bring our port to the smoking room and he would explain everything. We did. We arranged ourselves around the fireplace, the familiar smell of coal smoke and leather and tobacco, the comfortable Victorian architecture of a life lived with certainty, and he stood in front of the fire and told us what had happened to him, and the certainty began to come apart. "I left from the laboratory," he said, "a week ago by your reckoning. Minutes ago by mine, subjectively I mean the time I actually experienced." He looked down at his hands, turned them over. I pushed the lever forward just slightly at first to confirm the function, and then I kept going. "How far?" Philby said. "Far enough," the time traveler said. "That's not 800,000 years," he said, "give or take." The fire crackled. Someone's port glass touched a side table with a small, precise sound. 800, the medical man started. 1,000, the time traveler confirmed, years into the future. He looked at us, each of us in turn. He was watching for something, disbelief probably. The particular defensive rejection of a mind encountering information it cannot integrate. He'd expected it, maybe braced for it. What he found, I think, surprised him. We believed him, not because the story was plausible. It wasn't. Not because the physics was settled. It wasn't. We believed him because of the coat, because of the stains, because of that look in his eyes, the look of a man who has seen the end of everything and come back to sit in a leather chair in Richmond and drink port and try to explain it to people who still thought the future was a long way off. "Tell us," I said, and he did. Fourth. Time traveling, the first seconds are the hardest, he said. He was leaning forward now, elbows on knees. Port forgotten on the side table. The fire threw shadows across his face that made him look older than he was. The machine begins to move and the laboratory is still around you, but the light starts to change just slightly at first. The gas jets flicker not from a draft but because the day is cycling. Night comes and goes in a second, then half a second, then faster. He pressed his fingers together, measuring something invisible. "Mrs. Watch it, you know her. She manages the house. She crossed the laboratory while I was accelerating. I saw her. She moved like a projectile, a blur from one end of the room to the other, there and gone in the time it takes to blink. She couldn't see you," the psychologist said. "A flash perhaps, if she happened to be looking in the right direction at precisely the right instant." He shook his head. "But I was moving too fast. I was already—" He stopped, reorganized. "Imagine a film run at 1,000 times its normal speed. Every frame still true, every image still real. But to an observer watching it at that speed, the people in it are phantoms. They barely exist." The psychologist nodded slowly. The skepticism was gone. Whatever had replaced it wasn't quite belief yet, but it was open, which in the psychologist was nearly the same thing. "I accelerated," the time traveler continued. "The laboratory disappeared. The house disappeared, not destroyed, but dissolved into the larger motion of things. Outside the machine I could see the garden. I watched it change, seasons in seconds, the growth of trees I had planted myself, going from saplings to full height in what felt like minutes. Then the trees dying back, new ones, the geometry of the garden shifting as decades, then centuries, compacted into the space between heartbeats." He stopped, looked at the fire. "It's a kind of madness," he said quietly. "Watching that, being the only fixed point in a world that is flowing past you like water, you understand viscerally, not just intellectually, how temporary everything is. Every house and wall and road, every arrangement of stone that humans have spent their lives constructing, all of it just foam on a current, here and gone." "How did you know when to stop?" I asked. "I didn't," he said, "not precisely. I watched the numbers on the chronometer, the instrument on the machine that registers temporal position, and I chose a figure. A small, slightly rueful smile. 802,701 years approximately. I slowed, the world resolved around me. The smile faded and I saw what we had become. V. In the golden age, the first thing," he said, "was the light." He picked up his port glass, turned it in his fingers, set it down without drinking. Everything was green, intensely, almost aggressively green. I materialized in what had been what was some kind of garden, though garden is too small a word, a park, an estate, something designed, clearly once designed, but so old that the design had been subsumed into something that felt natural. Trees like nothing I'd ever seen, broad and ancient, with bark that caught the late afternoon sun and turned it gold. Flowering things everywhere. Profligate, wasteful looking, as if beauty had been given unlimited resources and unlimited time and told to do its worst. He paused. The air was warm, soft. The smell was extraordinary, something between hay and honey and old rain on hot stone. He touched his jaw, remembering. I sat in the machine for a full minute before I moved, just breathing, trying to get my bearings in a world where all my bearings were useless. He'd landed near a large building. Or what had been a building. The scale of it, he said, that was the first shock. The ruins, because it was already ruins, already ancient, already softened by centuries of growth, were colossal. Pillars 4 times the height of anything in London. Stone carved with figures worn smooth by time until they were more suggestion than image, and draped over all of it, claiming it. The green vines and moss and flowering things that had been growing for so long they were the building as much as the stone was. And then the people. They emerged from the shadows of the colonnade, he said, slowly, cautiously, the way deer emerge from a forest edge. His voice shifted slightly, something gentler in it, something that might have been wonder. They were beautiful, that's the only honest word, small, no taller than a child of 8 or 9 by our measure, though clearly adults with large, soft eyes and a quality of movement that was. He searched for it, not languid exactly, effortless, as if gravity had come to some private arrangement with them. The Eloi, that was the name he would later assign them, drawing on whatever dim linguistic remnant they possessed. The Eloi, the inheritors of the earth. They wore robes, light things, almost translucent, dyed in colors that had no names in our color vocabulary. Flowers in their hair. They touched the machine with no fear at all, which should have told me something immediately, but I was too overwhelmed to read it correctly. He shook his head at his own past self. They seemed happy. Genuinely uncomplicated happy, in the way that animals seem happy, not the achieved happiness of a person who has fought for contentment, but the baseline happiness of a creature for whom suffering is simply not present. Utopia, the editor said. There was an edge of hunger in his voice. He was already composing the headline. The time traveler looked at him. That's what I thought, he said, at first. #6, the sunset of mankind. The buildings could have housed 10,000 people. There were perhaps a few hundred. He said it flatly, let the arithmetic do its work. The structures, the parts still functional, still used, were vast and beautiful and maintained with a kind of passive incompetence. Not neglected. Exactly, not destroyed, but repaired the way a child repairs a toy, without full understanding, patching what was visible, ignoring what was structural. The fountains worked, some of them. The floors were swept mostly. The great communal halls where they slept, altogether genderless and ageless in their arrangement, smelled of flowers and old stone and something else. He frowned. Something I couldn't name then, I can now. Nobody asked, he told us anyway. Decay. He said, very slow, very old decay. The smell of a civilization that has been dying for so long it can no longer remember what living felt like. He picked up the port glass, drank this time. They had no books, no industry, no science, no conflict, or none that I could observe. They ate fruit, gathered from the gardens that once someone had deliberately cultivated and that now simply produced by the inertia of old design. They played, they slept, they were, by any measure I could construct, extraordinarily content. That sounds, the psychologist began, like paradise. The time traveler shook his head. Think about it, if you removed every challenge from human life, every difficulty, every predator, every hardship, what would you be removing? Not just the pain, the pressure, the force that compresses organic life into intelligence, into adaptation, into growth. He spread his hands. These creatures had been comfortable for so long that comfort had eaten them. Their minds were not gone, not destroyed, but quieted, reduced. The intelligence was still there, the way fire is still there in cold ash, the structure, the remnant, but nothing that would catch. He looked around the room. They were human, he said. They were unmistakably human, but they had become something less than what we are, not through catastrophe, not through war or plague or asteroid. The word wasn't available to him, his century, but his meaning was precise. Through success, through solving all the problems. He paused, through winning. The fire had burned down, nobody moved to stoke it. And the night, I said, what happened at night? Something changed in his face. That's when I understood, he said, that I had only seen half the world. #7th. A sudden shock, the machine was gone. He'd realized it suddenly. Mid-afternoon of his first day in the future. He'd been talking to a group of Eloi, or trying to extracting words from their liquid musical language, building a fragile structure of rudimentary communication, when something shifted at the edge of his awareness. An absence where there should have been a presence. He'd turned. The machine wasn't there. The feeling, he said, and his voice went very quiet, was unlike anything I can adequately describe. Imagine waking up and finding that the ground has been removed from under the concept of ground. The machine was my only way home, my only connection to the world that contained everything I knew, this house, this city, this century. Without it, I was stranded 800,000 years from everything that had ever mattered to me, surrounded by beautiful, childlike creatures who barely had language, and absolutely had no understanding of what I needed or what I'd lost. He'd run directly to where the machine had been, in the long grass near the pedestal of a great bronze sphinx, a vast thing green with age that presided over the garden with a smile that he'd found beautiful at first and that now struck him as something else entirely. The grass was flattened. The machine was gone, and set into the base of the sphinx he found what looked like a door, bronze green, massive. Set into the stone without visible hinges or handle that had not been there before, or that he hadn't noticed before, which was worse. I tried everything, he said. My hands against the bronze looking for a seam, my shoulder against it. I looked for tools. I looked for leverage. He stopped, pressed his lips together for a moment. I believe I shouted. I'm not certain how long I stood there, long enough for the sun to move significantly. He'd looked around. The Eloi who'd been near him had drifted away. They did that, drifted, dissolved back into the green garden and the green shadows as smoothly as mist. None of them were watching him, None of them seemed to register his distress, but something else was watching. He knew it the way you know when a room has someone in it before you see them. A quality of attention directed at you from a direction you can't identify. He'd felt it since materialization, half noticed and dismissed as the residue of temporal travel. Now standing in front of the locked sphinx with the machine behind that bronze door, he understood it wasn't residue, he was being observed. By what? Philby said. The time traveler looked at him. I'll get there, he said. #8. Explanation. He slept in the great hall with the Eloi that first night. No choice, darkness came, and with it a change in the Eloi that he hadn't anticipated. The languor remained. The beauty remained, but something else arrived. Fear. Not sophisticated, not analytical. Primal, absolute. The fear of a creature that has learned over millennia that the darkness contains things that will kill it. They crowded into the hall together as the light failed. Packed in close, adults and children and the indeterminate middle ground of Eloi who seemed to exist in a permanent state of aesthetic perfection that made age impossible to determine. They lit small lamps that burned some sweet-smelling oil. They clustered around the light the way his ancestors had clustered around fire. He lay among them and thought. He thought about the logic of what he was seeing. Start with the facts. The Eloi were fragile, small, underpowered in every practical sense. They lived in the ruins of massive structures clearly built by something more capable. They ate fruit from gardens maintained by no visible hand. The bronze sphinx was locked. Something had taken his machine, something was watching. And every night the Eloi were terrified. He thought about the Victorian economy, the class structure he'd been born into and had never questioned with sufficient rigor. The underground workers and the surface owners. The people who lived in the clean upper stories and the people who lived in the basement in the dark doing the work that kept the upper stories running. Extrapolate that, 800,000 years of it. The Eloi weren't the future of humanity, he told us, not all of it. He looked at his hands again. The human race had divided not by choice or not consciously, by pressure, by economics, by the grinding logic of who does the difficult work and who receives the benefits of it. The workers went underground. Over generations, centuries, millennia, they adapted, they changed. He looked up. Down there in the tunnels and the vast underground chambers. In the dark, there was another branch, the other half of the future. He paused. The Morlocks, he said, #9. The Morlocks. He found a ventilation shaft. 3 days into his time, 3 days of increasingly desperate investigation of the landscape, building the map in his head, refusing to stop moving even when the Eloi watched him with their gentle, incomprehending eyes. He found a well. Not a water well. A shaft about a meter across. Sinking straight down into the earth. Metal rungs set into the stone at intervals, and rising from it, warm air, the sound of machinery faint, rhythmic, like a vast industrial engine running at depth, and the smell of blood. I climbed down, he said simply. The medical man made an involuntary sound. I had a box of matches, that was all. He said it without apology. The matches were nearly gone by the time I found what was down there. He described it in fragments. The scale of the underground, enormous, cavernous, carved out over centuries by something that knew how to work stone and metal. The machinery, giant spinning things, massive levers, an entire industrial civilization running in total darkness by creatures that had evolved past the need for light. The smell, meat and machine oil and something organic that he couldn't name and didn't want to name. And the Morlocks. They were pale, he said, not the pallor of illness. The pallor of something adapted to darkness over thousands of generations, the way cave fish adapt, eyes huge and colorless, skin almost translucent, hair white and fine as cobweb. They moved, he stopped. They moved like things that had no concept of being watched, that had never needed the concept. They moved with perfect confidence in the dark. And when my match flared, they recoiled briefly and then recovered and came back toward me with a purpose that was. He stopped again. Purposeful, he said finally. That's what was most disturbing. The Eloi were beautiful and empty. The Morlocks were, he searched for the word, intent. They maintained the machines that sustained everything on the surface. They grew the food in underground chambers, by methods I couldn't investigate closely enough to understand. They made the clothing the Eloi wore, they fed the civilization above them. He paused, and in exchange, he looked at the fire. They fed on the Eloi, he said, complete silence. Not often, I think, not wastefully, the way a farmer doesn't slaughter all his cattle. His voice was very flat. The Eloi lived in fear of the dark because the dark was when the Morlocks came up. When they took one, the Eloi accepted this. Not consciously, I don't think they had sufficient cognition for acceptance in any meaningful sense, but as a fact of their existence. As a pressure they'd lived under for so long that it had become simply weather. My God, the editor said. 800,000 years, the time traveler said. That's where we're going, that's what progress leads to if it leads to ease instead of engagement, instead of struggle. He picked up the port glass and set it down again, untouched. The Morlocks had the machine, I needed to get it back, and I had, he looked at his coat, the torn shoulder. I had approximately 0 advantages and a box of matches. X. When night came, he understood the Morlocks pattern. They came at night. Topside, through the ventilation shafts and through other openings he'd begun to locate, marked now in his mental map. They were capable in darkness. In light, especially the sudden, shocking light of a struck match, they recoiled. Not in permanent damage, not in pain exactly, in disruption. It scrambled something in their adapted neurology, broke the smooth confidence of creatures that had lived without the sun for 1,000 generations. This was his leverage, small, fragile, temporary leverage, but it was something. He'd also found something else. There was a girl, he said. The room shifted. Everyone sat slightly straighter. Weena, he said. The name came out with a gentleness that was jarring, given everything else he was describing. Small even by the standards of her kind, eyes like a deer. She'd fallen into one of the irrigation channels. The Eloi, for all their grace, couldn't swim, apparently hadn't needed to in so long that the skill had gone the way of everything else they'd lost, and I'd pulled her out. He'd expected gratitude to be as foreign to them as mathematics. He'd been wrong. She attached herself to me. He said, followed me, brought me fruit, slept against my arm in the hall at night. Wound flowers into chains and put them around my wrists. He looked at his wrists. He stopped. She was not a child. She was a fully adult creature of her species, but she had the emotional life of a child, simple, direct, complete. Her happiness was complete when she was happy. Her fear was complete when she was afraid. He looked up. Her trust was complete when she trusted. A pause. I need you to understand that, he said, before I tell you the rest. 11th, the palace of green porcelain. He needed weapons. Specifically, he needed something to make fire on demand, not the ration flickers of his dwindling matches, but sustained, reliable, directional fire. The thing that had kept hominids alive for 1,000,000 years before his present, the equalizer, the tool that said, I am not prey. He'd spotted the building 3 kilometers northwest. Even from a distance, in the haze of an afternoon in the dying centuries of the world, there was something purposeful about it. The scale was Victorian museum, no larger, the scale of something civic and monumental, built for the ages. The material, as they approached, he and Weena, her hand in his, her bare feet silent on the grass that had reclaimed the ancient roads, was porcelain. Green porcelain, great slabs of it, fitted together with a precision that the building's current state of semi-ruin made even more remarkable. I knew what it was before I was inside, he told us. The shape of it, the organization, a museum of natural history of what had been natural history to the people who built it. Rows of desiccated creatures under glass, fossils, models of machines, books though the pages were powder and the covers barely held their shape. And then, in a side gallery, dynamite. Not labeled as such, the labels were 800 millennia out of date and no longer legible, but unmistakably itself. The chemical smell, the compressed cylinders, the way they sat in a case with the reverent display arrangement of something once considered important and now merely historical. Also, matches, a whole cabinet of them. Sealed by some curator's foresight in airtight glass, phosphorus-dipped, some still viable. He'd filled his pockets. He'd also found a lever bar of iron and a cloth he could use as a torch if soaked in the machine oil he'd taken from the underground. I was still carrying the flowers she'd given me, he said. When I left the museum, they were wilting. She'd put them around my wrist in the morning, and by late afternoon they were. He stopped. I noticed because she noticed. She touched them, the dead ones. Looked at me with an expression. He pressed his fingers against his eyes for a moment. I cannot explain what it was like to be looked at that way, he said, by a creature who was the last echo of something that had once been human in a world where everything I understood as civilization was 800,000 years in the past. Like being the only real person in a dream, like. He pulled his hands away. I needed the machine, he said. Focus. In the darkness, the hill, there was a hill to the southwest with trees, old trees, the kind of density that accumulated over centuries. He'd assessed it as shelter. High ground, defensible-ish in the primitive sense that high ground with trees was defensible. He and Weena made for it as the afternoon light began a slide toward gold. They didn't make it before dark. The Morlocks came out of the ground like water, he said. His voice had gone very still. No warning. No build-up. The light dropped and they were simply there, already moving, already surrounding. You couldn't see them in the dark, not with normal eyes, but you could hear them. The sound of bare feet on grass, the sound of breathing, and the feel of hands, light hands, quick hands, clever hands, touching. He'd struck a match. They'd recoiled. White faces in the light, those enormous colorless eyes contracted to pinpoints by the sudden photons. He'd glimpsed them, truly seen them for the first time in open air, in quantity, and something in his stomach had turned over at the wrongness of it. Not horror, not disgust, something more complicated. These had been people too once. These had been the workers, the underground, the ones who'd kept everything running for the ones above who'd never once looked down. 800,000 years of that arrangement. He felt something close to pity. Then the match went out. Keep moving. Said more to himself than to us. I kept telling myself, keep moving. The tree line was there, 30 meters, 20, the hands touching my coat again. Weena screaming. He stopped. She fell, he said, or was pulled. I couldn't. He stopped again. I couldn't see in that darkness. I could hear her, then I couldn't hear her. His voice was completely flat now. I lit everything I had, he said. Cloth soaked in oil, threw it, set the grass on fire, not deliberately. The fire spread from the torch when I dropped it, going for them with the lever bar. He paused. The fire spread too well, too fast, the dry grass of 3 hot summers in the future taking a fire the way tinder does. He looked at us. I ran, he said. I'm not proud of it. I ran for the tree line and I made the trees and I climbed and I held on while the fire ran below me and the Morlocks scattered from it. A long pause. I didn't find her, not in the dark. Not in the fire. The room was very quiet. I'm sorry, I said. He looked at me. Something moved in his eyes and then went still. She had trusted me completely, he said. That was the thing. That was the entire thing. # 13th, the trap of the white sphinx. He went back to the sphinx. What else was there to do? Dawn, gray and gold, and the smell of the grass fire still in the air, the smoke of it drifting. And the Eloi already up and moving and apparently untouched by the night's events in any lasting sense, their collective memory as short as their attention, the tragedy of Weena already processed, already gone, already subsumed back into the smooth, undisturbed flow of their days. He walked to the sphinx. He walked to the locked bronze door in its base, and the door was open. He stopped, stood there, looked at the black interior beyond the open door. It was a trap, he said. I knew it immediately. The Morlocks had opened it because they wanted me inside. They'd taken the machine for exactly this reason, not to study it, not to destroy it, but to lure me in. He looked at his hands. They were clever. That was what I kept having to remind myself. Beautifully, terribly clever. Everything they did was purposeful. The trap was elegant. Come for the machine, come into the dark, and then he shrugged. I went in anyway, he said, because of the machine. The medical man asked, because there was no other option, he said. The machine or eternity in the gardens with the Eloi. He paused. I had my remaining matches. I had the lever bar. I went in. The machine was there. He'd known it would be. He could see it in the match light, the ivory and crystal and nickel exactly as he'd left it, positioned with a deliberate care that confirmed the trap. The Morlocks hadn't damaged it. They'd preserved it, studied it perhaps. Certainly been baffled by it and then positioned it as bait. They were in the dark around him. He couldn't see them, he could feel them. He went for the machine, the match went out, hands on him, many hands simultaneously confident and coordinated. They'd done this before countless times, the communal hunting of the dark. He got one hand on the machine, found the lever, struck the last match with the other hand. Their faces in the light, a ring of them close, those pale eyes. Not malevolent, he was clear about this, even then not malevolent, practical, the way a farmer's face is practical. I pulled the lever, he said, # 14th. The further vision he didn't stop, that was the thing. He got clear of the Morlocks, clear of the Sphinx, clear of 802, 701, and he kept going, the lever forward, the days cycling into flicker. He had no plan for this. It wasn't rational. He was running. The way you run when the rational thing and the instinctive thing point in the same direction, and instinct is faster. The world changed around him. He watched it change. The sun, he said slowly. The sun was getting bigger, that's the first thing I noticed. Larger in the sky, redder, not bright yellow, deep red, the color of cooling iron. He paused, the earth was slowing, the rotation, tidal drag from an aging, expanding sun over astronomical time. I'd known this theoretically. We all know it, but watching it happen. The chronometer registered numbers that lost meaning, millions, tens of millions. The sky went dark, he said, not night dark, just reduced, as if the sun were breathing out rather than breathing in. The vegetation was gone, rock and red light and something that might have been lichen or might have been the last echo of something that had once been more. The ocean, what was left of it, was dark and still and immense, pressed against a coast that was no longer any coast I could name. He'd stopped the machine once briefly, set foot on the beach of the last sea, breathed the thin air. Something was still alive, he said quietly. In the water, I saw it, a shape, dark, moving, something that had outlasted everything else, everything more complex and more celebrated and more conscious, just living, just continuing. He paused. I didn't look at it for long. He'd gone further. I don't know how far, he said. I lost track of the numbers. The sun filled half the sky, red and enormous, and the tide was locked. The earth's face turned permanently toward it, and there was no sound, no movement, only rock and red light and cold. He stopped. I turned around. # 15th. The time traveler's return. He came back at 4 in the morning. The laboratory resolving around him out of the temporal medium like a print developing in a chemical bath, slow, then sudden, then complete, the gas jets still burning. Mrs. Watch its cup on the counter exactly where she'd left it, the smell of coal and ozone. He sat in the machine for a long time, then he got up. He checked his reflection in a mirror on the laboratory wall, the torn coat, the stains. The face of a man who had been gone for a week subjectively and a moment objectively, and who had seen in that moment what waited at the end of everything. He went upstairs, he bathed, he changed into clean clothes, and he came to dinner. That's everything, he told us. The fire was completely out now, the room was cold, none of us had moved to fix either of these things. That's the entire story, he said. I've thought about whether to tell you. I've thought about what use it is to know, I've decided. He picked up the port glass finally and drank the rest of it. I've decided that knowledge is always preferable to ignorance, whatever it costs. That was what separated us from the Eloi. What has to keep separating us? He set the glass down. We have to keep finding it difficult. If we stop finding it difficult, we become. He gestured vaguely at the space where his story had lived for the past 2 hours. None of us spoke. I stayed after the others left. I sat with him for an hour, both of us in the cooling room, not talking much. He was somewhere else. I didn't press him. There are places a person goes after certain kinds of experience where company is useful but conversation isn't. When I left, I shook his hand. He looked at me with those hollow, overbright eyes. Come tomorrow, he said. I want to show you something. #16. After the story, I came the next day. Noon, the house smelled of coal and ambition as always. The laboratory door was open. I went in. The machine was gone, not stolen, not locked behind a bronze door. The circle in the leather mat where it had sat, the permanent impression of its weight, was there. But the machine was not. Mrs. Watchett was at the counter. Her expression in the specific register of concern but determined not to pry that I recognized as British restraint in the face of the genuinely inexplicable. He was here at first light, she said. I heard the machines, then he was not here. Did you see him leave? I asked. I saw him sit down, she said, in the machine, and then she stopped. And then I did not. I stood in the laboratory for a long time. He did not come back, not that day, not that week. Not in the years I've been waiting since. I think about the flowers sometimes. The wilting flowers he described on his wrist, the ones Weena had put there in the morning in the years from now. The way she'd touched them when they were dying and looked at him. The completeness of her trust. I think he went back. I don't know when he aimed for or what he thought he could change. Or whether he understood that you cannot save people who have been formed by 800,000 years of a particular arrangement from the consequences of that arrangement. Whether knowledge taken back is enough. I don't know. I still bring flowers to dinner on Thursdays. I still take the seat at the far end of the table where the light is good and the conversation carries. I still look at the door when there are footsteps in the hall. He is a man of unusual gifts. The dangerous kind of gifts. The kind that once they have shown you something, make it impossible to unsee. He is somewhere in time. I believe he is still moving forward. I hope wherever he lands, the day is long and the light is good, and there is someone there who can still find it difficult. The time engine end. Chapter 2, The Fourth Dimension. The man we called the Time Traveler was talking fast. His pale gray eyes had gone electric. That polished, usually bloodless face flushed now, alive with something that looked almost dangerous. The fire crackled behind him. Silver gas lamps threw soft light across crystal glasses, and tiny bubbles rose and burst in the wine like punctuation marks in a sentence none of us yet understood. His chairs held us. Literally. Patent design, curved spines that conformed to the body that received you. Combined with the port in the late hour, it made skepticism feel like too much work. He stood at the head of the table and aimed one lean finger at the center of the room. At nothing, at everything. Follow me carefully. His voice had dropped. I'm going to dismantle something you believe is solid. The geometry they taught you, every theorem, every proof, it's built on a flaw. Philby made a sound, red-haired. Constitutionally argumentative, Philby was incapable of letting anything pass. That's rather a large opening position. I'm not asking for blind faith, just attention. He began to pace. A mathematical line, pure length, zero thickness. Does it actually exist? Abstraction, the psychologist said. Obviously, a plane, length and width, no depth, real, also an abstraction. Right, so follow the logic. A cube, length, width, depth, real, now there. Philby said, sitting forward. I push back. Solid objects exist. I can put my hand on a solid object. Can you? He stopped pacing. Let the silence stretch one beat too long. Can an instantaneous cube exist, a cube that occupies space for literally zero duration of time? Philby opened his mouth, closed it, because if it can't, if nothing can exist for zero time, then every real object must have extent in a fourth direction. He held up 4 fingers, length, width, depth. He folded 3 down and left 1 standing, duration. The fire popped, nobody spoke. We live in 4 dimensions, he said quietly. The 3 we navigate every day in time, they are the same kind of thing. We just can't see it because our consciousness drags itself along the time axis at one fixed speed, one fixed direction, cradle to grave, like a bead on a wire. We experience time as different from space for the same reason a man born blind experiences color as different from sound. The limitation is in us, not in the universe. The very young man at the far end of the table, he'd been wrestling with a dead cigar for 10 minutes, looked up. That's actually quite clear, he said with an expression suggesting it wasn't quite, but he could see the shape of it from here. There are mathematicians asking the right questions. The time traveler continued, and now there was an edge of excitement in his voice, controlled but present, the way pressure builds behind a sealed valve. Newcomb presented work to the New York Mathematical Society not 6 weeks ago. The central question, if space has 3 dimensions, why not a 4th spatial axis, perpendicular to all the others simultaneously? We can render a 3-dimensional form on a 2-dimensional surface. He tapped a piece of paper flat on the table. So why couldn't a 3-dimensional model represent a 4-dimensional object? The maths works, the geometry holds. The provincial mayor frowned so hard his face folded like a letter. His lips moved silently, then something behind his eyes shifted. Yes, he said. Yes, yes. I've been working in this space for years. He moved to the mantelpiece, picked up a series of small framed photographs and dealt them across the table like cards. Same man, 8 years old, 15, 23, 40. You see, each photograph is a cross-section, a 3-dimensional slice of a 4-dimensional object. The real man, the complete man, extends through time the way a river extends through landscape. The photographs are just cores drilled out of him at different points. He picked up a folded paper from the side table, a barometric weather chart, lines rising and falling in ink. He ran his finger along one curve. Yesterday afternoon, pressure here. Last night it dropped. This morning it climbed. Mercury traced that line. He looked up. In which dimension did it move? Not left or right, not up or down, not forward or back. His finger landed hard on the page. It moved through time. That line is drawn in the time dimension. We don't even notice. The medical man had been staring into the fire with the focused vacancy of a man solving a problem in his head. He looked up now. All right, he said. Granted, for the sake of argument, time is a 4th dimension. Then why can't we move through it? We move through the other 3 constantly. The time traveler almost smiled. Do we? Freely? Of course. Left and right, yes. Forward and back, but up. Balloons exist for 40 years. Before that, before Montgolfier, a man who wanted to move vertically could jump. That was it. Spasmodic, uncontrolled, limited to whatever muscle he had in his legs. He paused. Gravity is a constraint on movement through one spatial dimension. We didn't call that dimension unreal just because we couldn't move through it freely. We built machines until we could. The medical man had no answer for that. Here's the thing about time. His voice went quieter, more intense. We are already moving through it, all of us, right now. Our conscious existence travels the time dimension at a fixed rate, steady, involuntary, unstoppable, like falling, like a man dropped 50 miles above the Earth's surface, falling toward the ground at constant speed with no way to brake or steer. He looked around the table, met each set of eyes. Unless someone builds a machine. Philby laughed. It was the laugh of a man defending something he suspects might not hold. It's against reason, Philby said. Which reason specifically? You can logic your way to any conclusion if you're clever enough. Doesn't make it real. No, he agreed, which is why I have experimental verification. The room went still. Long ago, he said, I had a theory, then a design. The design became a working prototype. He paused, let that land, a machine. A machine to travel in any direction along the time dimension at any velocity the operator chooses, forward or back. For a moment nobody moved, then everyone started talking at once. You could go back, the psychologist said, leaning forward, voice sharpening with the sudden possibility. Hastings, the actual Battle of Hastings, eyewitness. You terrify them, the medical man said. Our ancestors were not known for their patience with inexplicable arrivals. Homer, the young man said, half to himself. You could get Homer's Greek from Homer. The university examiners would fail you for it, someone shot back. German scholars have improved Homer considerably. The original would be considered wrong. The future, the young man continued in the tone of a man doing arithmetic that excites him. Invest everything, let it compound, arrive in 50 years and collect. Or arrive, I said, to find it's all been collectivized and your compounded fortune belongs to the state. Of all the psychologist began. Yes, the time traveler cut through the noise. That's exactly the kind of thing I kept thinking about, why I kept quiet for years. He was smiling now, thin and controlled, but I have results and the results want showing. Show us then, Philby said. Demonstration, the psychologist agreed, though his tone still carried the protective edge of a man who does not intend to be fooled. Let's see what you've actually got. The time traveler looked around at all of us. Something moved behind those pale eyes, satisfaction or the compressed excitement of a man who has been waiting a very long time to be believed. He pushed his hands deep into his trouser pockets, turned, and walked out of the room. We listened to his slippers on the floorboards, the long passage, receding toward the laboratory at the back of the house. The psychologist looked around at the empty space where our host had been. What do you think he has? Conjurer's trick, the medical man said. Cabinet work and mirrors. Philby started to tell us about a stage magician he'd witnessed in Burslem. Elaborate setup, reached the third sentence of his premise, and the time traveler walked back in. In his hands was something none of us had a word for yet. Chapter 3. The model reveals everything. The device sat at the center of the table like a dare. Brass and ivory, crystalline rods catching the firelight, smaller than a mantel clock, more intricate than anything I'd seen come out of any workshop in London. The time traveler had carried it in from the laboratory with the careful reverence of a man transporting something genuinely dangerous. He set it on the octagonal table, drew up a chair, sat. We arranged ourselves around him without thinking, a reflex, the way iron filings orient to a magnet. I was closest, nearly wedged between him and the fire. Philby hovered at his shoulder. The medical man and the provincial mayor flanked him on the right. The psychologist took the left. The very young man pressed in behind, craning his neck. Nobody spoke. The lamp threw a hard circle of light across the mechanism. A dozen candles burned in their sconces around the room. I remember thinking that if there was trickery happening here, it would have to be extraordinary. We were close, we were watching, there were no angles we weren't covering. Well, the psychologist said, the time traveler pressed his hands together above the device like a man in prayer, or like a man containing himself. It's a model, he said, a proof of concept, a machine for traveling through time. Silence, he pointed to a slender bar near the center. Look at that, really look. Something's wrong with it, isn't it? It seems off, like it doesn't sit quite right with the rest of the room. He was correct, the bar had a quality I couldn't name, a faint, persistent shimmer, not a trick of the candlelight, something intrinsic. Here, he indicated two small levers, each no longer than a finger, one white, one white. One sends it forward, one sends it back, and this saddle here, he touched a tiny molded seat at the machine's center, is where the operator sits. The medical man stood and leaned in close, examining the framework with professional skepticism. His eyes moved the way they did at a patient's bedside. It's beautifully made, he said. 2 years, the time traveler said. There was an edge in his voice, not pride, something rower. 2 years of my life. We each took our turn leaning in. The craftsmanship was undeniable, the crystalline rods, the interlocked gearing. The ivory inlays worn smooth in certain places where hands had worked and reworked the tolerances. The time traveler waited until we'd settled back into our positions. Now, his voice dropped, more serious, more careful. I want to be absolutely clear about what you're about to see. I'm going to press that lever. The machine will move into the future. It will accelerate through time so rapidly that it will become invisible to us, not because it disappears, but because it is moving through each of our present moments too quickly to register, and then it will be gone. The psychologist opened his mouth. The time traveler held up a hand. I know what you're thinking, don't think it yet, watch first. He reached toward the lever, stopped. No, he turned to the psychologist. Give me your hand. The psychologist blinked. I beg your pardon, your hand, and point your finger. He took the man's hand with a firm, deliberate grip and extended the forefinger. I don't want there to be any ambiguity about who operates it. The psychologist's face cycled through 3 emotions in 2 seconds. Then his finger made contact with the lever. The room changed, not dramatically, not with any sound or flash. The lever moved. There was a breath of air from nowhere, sourceless, inexplicable, that made the lamp flame stagger and snuff one of the candles on the mantel completely. And the machine, it blurred. Spun, became something halfway between an object and a memory of an object. A ghost built from brass and ivory and fading light. An eddy, a suggestion, gone. The table was empty. No one moved, no one breathed. The lamplight sat on bare wood. Then Philby said something that I won't put into print. The psychologist dropped to his knees and looked under the table. The time traveler laughed, not cruelly. More like a man releasing pressure that has been building for 2 years in a workshop with no one to share it. He stood, moved to the mantel, picked up the tobacco jar and began filling his pipe with his back to us. Well, he said, exactly echoing the psychologist from a minute ago. We looked at each other. The medical man recovered first. Are you serious? He said. Do you genuinely believe that machine just traveled through time? I don't believe it. He turned, touching a spill to the fire, drawing flame into the bowl of his pipe. I know it. The psychologist was still staring at the empty table. He seemed to become aware of this, stood up and reached for a cigar with studied composure. His hands were not entirely steady. The future, Philby said. You're saying it went to the future. Forward or back, the time traveler said. I can't say with certainty which. The psychologist got his cigar lit. Some of the color had returned to his face, and with it his professional instincts. He straightened. It must have gone into the past, he said. Logically, explain, if it's still in this room in this time stream but traveling forward, then it would have to pass through every moment between now and whenever it stops. It would be here right now, somewhere in that space. He gestured at the empty air above the table. Since we can't see it, it must have gone backward. I was ahead of him. No. I said that doesn't hold either. If it went backward, it would have been in this room last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before we'd have seen it. The provincial mayor nodded slowly. That's a serious objection. Not remotely, the time traveler said. He looked at the psychologist. You can answer it. Think about perception. Think about threshold. The psychologist was quiet for 3 seconds, then something clicked behind his eyes. Sub-threshold stimulation. He said, of course. He stood straighter. It's the same principle as a spinning wheel spoke or a rifle bullet in flight. The machine exists in each moment it passes through, but it passes through each moment so rapidly that the impression it leaves on the eye is too brief to register. If it moves through a single minute of our time in a fraction of a second, 1/50th, 100th, then the visual stimulus it creates is diluted by exactly that ratio. It becomes effectively invisible, not absent, invisible. He passed his hand slowly through the empty space where the machine had been, the space where it possibly theoretically still was in some sense. You see, he said. Nobody spoke for a long moment. We sat around a bare table in a well-lit room and tried to rebuild our understanding of the universe from the ground up. It's plausible, the medical man said finally. Tonight it's plausible. Ask me again in the morning when I have my common sense back. The time traveler was already picking up the lamp. Come with me, he said. He led us down the corridor. Long, cold, the lamplight making our shadows lurch and stagger across the walls ahead of us. His silhouette moved with purpose, that broad, unusual head, the pipe trailing smoke. The laboratory, larger, colder, smelling of metal shavings and machine oil. And there it was. The same architecture as the model, but scaled up to human proportion. Nickel and ivory and quartz crystal, a proper seat, levers you could actually grip. Some of the twisted crystalline bars still lay rough on the workbench beside penciled schematics waiting to be fitted. I picked one up, cool and heavy, quartz I thought. The medical man walked slowly around it. Is this a trick? He asked quietly, like the ghost projection at Christmas. The time traveler raised the lamp. His face in the upcast light was stripped of all performance. On that machine, he said, I intend to travel through time, personally, as far forward or back as I choose. He let that sit. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. I looked across the workbench and found Philby's eyes in the dim light. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he winked, slow and solemn, like a man at a funeral. I still don't know what either of us meant by it. Chapter 4. The cleverness trap. The machine was real. None of us wanted to believe that, not yet. The problem was the man himself. The time traveler was too sharp, too quick, the kind of brilliant that makes you suspicious rather than impressed. You never felt like you were seeing all of him. There was always something held back, some card he hadn't shown, some mechanism running beneath the surface of his easy smile. If Philby had built the model and explained the theory, we'd have taken it seriously. Philby you could read. Philby had obvious motives. A child could map the inside of Philby's skull, but the time traveler, he made everything look effortless, and that was the problem. Effortless reads as performance, genius reads as trick. So in the week between that first Thursday and the next, none of us said much about time travel. We went back to our offices and our surgeries and our drawing rooms, and we told ourselves it was an illusion. Clever one, but an illusion. Still, it lived in the back of my mind, the plausibility of it, the terrifying, creeping plausibility. I ran into the medical man at the Linnean Society on Friday. I brought it up, the model, the vanishing, the candle blown out by a machine moving sideways through time. He said he'd seen something similar demonstrated once in Tübingen. He put great emphasis on the candle, but he couldn't explain the mechanism, neither could I. We left it there. Unresolved, the way you leave a splinter you can't quite reach. The following Thursday I went back to Richmond. I arrived late. 4 or 5 men already occupied the drawing room, the medical man standing before the fire with a note in one hand and his pocket watch in the other. The psychologist sat near the window. There were new faces too, the editor of a well-known daily, a journalist, and a quiet bearded man I'd never met and whose name I never caught. He didn't speak once the entire evening, not a single word. Our host was absent. 7:30, the medical man said, glancing at his watch. I think we'd better go in for dinner. Where is he? I asked. Just arrived, have you? He held up the note, unavoidably detained. His words, he's asked us to start at 7 if he's not back, says he'll explain when he comes. Shame to let the food go cold, said the editor. The doctor rang the bell. We ate without him. The conversation circled his absence the way a tongue circles a missing tooth, unable to leave it alone, unable to resolve it. I floated the idea of time travel as a half-joke and watched the editor's face go through 3 distinct phases of skepticism. The psychologist took it upon himself to explain what we'd witnessed the week before, the model, the lever, the machine shrinking and vanishing, and he was midway through his account, his voice settling into that flat academic register when the door from the corridor swung open. Slowly, without a sound, I was facing it. I saw it first. At last, I said, the door opened wider, and the time traveler stood in the frame. Someone made a sound. I think it was me. He looked like a man dragged back from the edge of something catastrophic. His coat was caked with dust, sleeves smeared green grass or moss or something I couldn't name. His hair was wild and seemed lighter somehow, as though color had been leached from it. His face was the color of old bone. There was a cut on his chin, brown at the edges, half-healed, days-old minimum. His expression was the expression of a man who had endured something the human nervous system was never designed to process. He stood in the doorway a moment, blinking, like the light hurt him. Then he walked in. The limp was bad, the slow, grinding limp of a man whose feet had carried him somewhere they should never have gone. We stared. No one spoke. We were waiting for him to explain, to launch into one of his performances, to make us feel foolish for worrying. He didn't speak. He just moved to the table slowly and looked at the wine. The editor filled a glass of champagne and slid it toward him. He lifted it and drained it in one motion, stood there a moment. Then something shifted in his face, a fraction of color returning, a ghost of the old expression surfacing like something rising from deep water. He held the glass out for more. "Good God, man," said the medical man. "What happened to you?" The time traveler seemed to process the question from a distance. "Don't let me interrupt," he said. His voice was wrong, thin, careful, like he was testing each word before he committed to it. "I'm all right." He drank again. "That's good," he said quietly. His eyes moved around the table, that familiar, assessing intelligence flickering back on, dim at first, then brighter. He looked at the warm room, the candlelight, the plates of food, the faces watching him, like a man confirming the reality of something he'd stopped believing in. "I'm going to wash and dress," he said. "Then I'll come down and explain everything." A pause. "Save me some of that mutton, I need meat." He looked at the editor, registered him as a new face, asked if he was well. The editor began a question. Shortly, the time traveler said, "Give me a minute. He stopped. Something crossed his face. "I'll be fine." He set down the glass and turned toward the stairs. That was when I saw his feet. He had no shoes, no socks worth mentioning, just shreds of fabric dark with old blood wrapped around his feet like bandages that had long since failed. The soft, ruined sound of his footsteps across the floor. The door closed behind him. I almost followed. I stopped myself. He hated a fuss. Remarkable behavior of an eminent scientist. The editor said, and I could hear him mentally typesetting it. "What's his game?" said the journalist. "What was that?" I looked at the psychologist, found my own certainty reflected in his eyes. The medical man recovered first. He rang the bell and ordered a hot plate. The editor picked up his fork. The silent man drank champagne with the focused determination of someone medicating acute anxiety. Dinner resumed. The editor grew louder and more skeptical in direct proportion to his discomfort. "Time travel," he said. "Right, and he got that dirty rolling around in a paradox, did he?" He laughed. The journalist laughed with him. They were the new kind, young, irreverent, fluent in ridicule. No clothes brushes in the future then. The journalist was halfway through a joke about our special correspondent in the day after tomorrow when the door opened again. The time traveler had changed into evening dress, washed, combed, composed. The haggard look was still there that you couldn't wash off, but the wreckage had been cleaned away. "They tell me you've been to the middle of next week," the editor called out, delighted with himself. "Give us the inside story. What's it worth to you?" The time traveler took his seat without a word. The quiet smile, the old one controlled and private, crossed his face. "Where's my mutton?" he said. "Story." The editor said, "Story be damned." The time traveler reached for his fork. "Food first. I won't say a word until I've eaten. Pass the salt." "One question," I said. "Just one. Have you been time traveling?" He looked at me, chewing, nodded once. "Yes." The table went quiet. He ate like a man who hadn't eaten in days, because he hadn't. The medical man watched him through half-closed eyes, cataloging. The silent man drank. The journalist tried to fill the silence with a story about someone called Hetty Potter and got nowhere. Finally, the time traveler pushed his plate back and looked at us. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I was starving." He reached for a cigar, clipped the end, and stood. "Come through to the smoking room. It's not a short story and I won't tell it here." He led the way. We followed. He settled into his chair, deep into it, like a man whose bones had been carrying something enormous and had only just set it down. The candles in the smoking room hadn't been lit. The only light was the lamp on the side table, and it caught his face in a tight white circle and left the rest of us in shadow. Somewhere behind me I could see the journalist's face and the legs of the silent man from the knees down. That was all. "You've told the new men about the machine?" he asked me. "It's a paradox," the editor said. "An interesting trick. I can't argue tonight." He said it without apology, without aggression, flat, final. "I'm too far gone for argument, but I'll tell you what happened to me if you want it, all of it. I need to tell it badly. Fair warning, most of it is going to sound like a lie." He paused, looked at the burning tip of his cigar. "It isn't. Every word is true. At 4 o'clock today I was in my laboratory. Since then," he stopped, looked at his hands. "I have lived 8 days that no human being has ever lived before." The room held its breath. "I'm nearly destroyed," he said quietly. But I won't sleep until I've said this out loud. Once I have, I'm going to bed and I'm going to sleep for a very long time." He looked around the circle of faces. "No interruptions, that's the condition. Can you agree to that?" "Agreed," said the editor. The rest of us said it too, and the time traveler began. He spoke slowly at first, the voice of a man still finding his way back to solid ground. But as the story gathered, something changed in him. He leaned forward, his eyes caught the light. The words came faster. "I cannot give you the half of it in writing. The words on this page are shadows. What mattered was his face, white and absolutely earnest in that small circle of lamplight, and his voice, and the way his expression moved with the story ahead of the story. Like a man reliving something in real time, we stopped looking at each other. We looked only at him. Chapter 5. First machine awakens. The machine was real. That was the first thing I told them. Last Thursday in this very room I'd laid out the theory, the fourth dimension, time as an axis you could move along, not just endure. I'd shown them the prototype. Gears and quartz and nickel and ivory, a saddle where a man could sit and aim himself at forever. Now it sat in the corner, battered. One ivory bar cracked clean through. A brass rail bent at an ugly angle. But the core of it, the crystalline heart of the thing, still hummed if you pressed your ear close enough. Friday I thought I was done. Nearly wept when I discovered a nickel rod cut 1 inch too short, 1 inch. I had it recast over the weekend, working through Saturday night with ash on my hands and oil in my beard. This morning, 10 o'clock, it was finished. I tightened the last screw, added a single drop of oil to the quartz rod, sat down in the saddle and wrapped my hands around the levers. I thought about what a man feels when he holds a pistol to his own skull, that vertiginous moment before, that terrible wonder about what comes next. That's exactly how it felt. I took the starting lever in my right hand, the stopping lever in my left, pressed the first. Then almost immediately the second. The room lurched. A falling sensation, nauseating and total, like the floor had ceased to exist beneath me. Then nothing. I was still in the laboratory. Everything exactly as before. Had anything happened at all? I sat very still, breathing, wondering if I'd simply gone mad, if all of it, the theory, the years of work, the machine itself, had been an elaborate fiction I'd told myself. Then I looked at the clock on the wall. A moment ago it had read 10 past 10. Now it read 3:30. 5 hours, gone, in the space of a breath. I gripped the lever with both hands and went. The laboratory hazed, grayed out. Then Mrs. Watchett walked in from the hallway, moving toward the garden door, and she crossed the entire room in the time it takes a thought to form. A human being reduced to a streak. I pushed the lever all the way forward. Night dropped like someone snuffed a candle. Then day, then night again, day, night, faster, my ears filled with a low thrumming roar. My thoughts came apart at the seams, not painfully, but the way a dream dissolves when you reach for it. The laboratory fell away. I was outside or above it, or the building simply ceased to matter. The sun moved, not rose and set, not the patient arc of a normal day. It leapt across the sky in seconds, dawn to dusk to dawn, over and over, each full cycle marking 24 hours erased. The sensation is almost impossible to explain. Imagine the worst carnival ride you've ever endured, that helpless, forward-falling panic, that sick certainty you're about to be destroyed. Now imagine it won't stop. Now imagine it going faster. Day, night, faster, faster. The moon stopped moving through phases and became a pale smear. The stars dissolved into faint circles of light, flickering in a sky that had turned a deep, luminous blue, the color of early twilight held permanently open. The sun became a line. A single burning arc stretched across the firmament, constant as a wire, blazing. I was moving at better than a year per minute. I know this because I watched snow flash across the hills and vanish. Flash and vanish, spring erupting and dying. The trees below me, the hillside this very house sits on, pulsed with color like a heartbeat. Green, brown, white, green, brown, white. A minute passed. A century passed with it. The nausea transformed into something else. Somewhere past the first 1,000 years. The sick fear thinned and something close to exhilaration took its place. A wild, almost unhinged joy. I was moving through time, not reading about it, not theorizing, not sketching diagrams in a notebook at midnight. Moving. The landscape blurred into impressionism. Vast buildings materialized and faded on the hillsides, colossal things, grander than anything I knew, built of what looked like pale stone and glass, rising and collapsing across the centuries like clouds. The green that covered the earth grew richer, more permanent. The seasonal snow began to disappear, and curiosity replaced terror. What had humanity become? The question hit me like a struck match. What had 10,000 years done to the species? What had we built? What had we solved? What diseases had we cured? What wars had we finally ended? What wonders had we stumbled into in the dark? But then, under the curiosity, fear again. Different this time, quieter. More considered. What if the answers were terrible? Then there was the matter of stopping. This was the part that had kept me awake, building the machine. The part I'd tried not to think too hard about. Here is the problem, stated plainly: matter occupies space. Two objects cannot occupy the same space simultaneously without a catastrophic exchange of energy. While I moved through time at velocity, thousands of years per minute, I was in some sense a ghost, attenuated, slipping through the molecular gaps of the world like vapor through a screen. But the moment I stopped, the instant the machine halted, I would become solid again, fully present, fully material, and if something occupied the space I intended to stop in, the math was simple and horrifying. My atoms would attempt to merge with theirs. The resulting chemical reaction would be less a collision and more a detonation. I would cease to exist, scattered across dimensions I had no names for. I had accepted this risk when I was building the machine, back in the safety of the workshop, back when it was theoretical. I told myself it was simply the price of discovery, the unavoidable gamble. Now, hurtling forward through centuries with the lever at maximum and my knuckles white against the grip, the risk felt considerably less abstract. I cannot stop, some part of my brain began to repeat. Then, like an idiot, like a panicking child, I yanked the lever back. Thunder. Pure and instantaneous. Then hail, driving sideways through the air, cold and merciless, soaking me to the bone in seconds. I was sitting on wet grass. The machine was on its side beside me, ticking faintly like a cooling engine. I sat there for a moment in the hissing downpour, the world still wobbling and gray. My ears rang. My jaw ached where the machine had caught it on its way over. Fine hospitality, I said to no one, for a man who's come so far. I climbed to my feet. The hail was beginning to thin. Through the gray curtain of the storm I could make out a garden, rhododendrons with mauve and purple blossoms, the petals beaten into the mud by the ice. Beyond them, massive and indistinct, a shape, large white stone. I stood very still. The hail slackened, the shape clarified, a sphinx, enormous, carved from pale stone, perched on a thick bronze pedestal gone green with age. Its wings weren't folded close against its body the way you'd expect. They were spread outward and slightly forward so it looked suspended. Hovering, a silver birch tree barely reached its shoulder. The face was turned toward me. The eyes were blank, sightless, and yet they seemed to watch. There was something carved into the set of the mouth, a suggestion of a smile, patient and private. The expression of a thing that has waited a very long time and expected to wait longer still. The stone was weathered deeply. Centuries of rain and freeze and sun had eaten at the surface, left it pocked and stained in patterns that looked uncomfortably like disease. I stood looking at it, half a minute, maybe longer, the hail thinned to nothing. Behind the sphinx, through the lifting mist, the world began to resolve. Buildings, vast ones, colonnaded and massive, pale stone catching the first light breaking through the clouds. A hillside thick with trees. The green so dense and dark it looked almost tropical. The sky, as the storm cleared, opened into a blue so saturated it seemed almost artificial, and the full weight of it hit me at once. I had done it. I had actually done it. I was standing in the deep future, on a wet lawn, dripping, looking at a world that had kept moving long after every person I had ever known was dust. What kind of world? The question was no longer abstract or exciting. My stomach clenched. What happened to us? I thought, what did we become? What if the intervening ages had sharpened cruelty instead of wisdom? What if the thing called humanity had grown powerful and cold, had shed its softness the way evolution sheds everything unnecessary? I stood there in my wet clothes beside my broken machine and thought, I am a man from 800,000 years ago. To whatever lives here, I might as well be an insect. Something ancient and small and fundamentally misunderstandable. Something that could simply be exterminated. The panic came fast, pure animal. I spun and grabbed the machine. Started working at the mechanism with both hands, trying to right it, trying to get back into the saddle, back to the levers. The storm broke. Full sunlight. Sudden and violent, the way sun hits after a summer thunderstorm, every surface blazing with reflected light. The hailstones caught in every groove and crevice of the great buildings glittering white. I stood in the middle of it, drenched and terrified, feeling more exposed than I had ever felt in my life. The feeling of a small animal caught in an open field, knowing without seeing it that something with wings is already circling above. I grabbed the machine with both hands, wrist, knee, full body, and wrenched at it frantically. It shifted. It toppled. The saddle caught me under the jaw. Hard enough to make my eyes water. I stood there, panting, one hand on the saddle, one on the lever, every muscle shaking, ready to run. Then slowly the panic began to drain. I was still standing. The world had not ended me. I straightened, took a long breath. Looked. In a circular window high up in the nearest building, faces, people watching me, robed in cloth that caught the light like deep water blues and golds and burgundies. Rich, soft, not hostile, curious. Then voices coming through the rhododendrons, coming toward me. I turned. A man emerged onto the lawn, small, barely 4 feet tall, delicate as fine porcelain, dressed in a purple tunic cinched at the waist with a thin leather belt. Bare legs, bare head, sandals on his feet. He stopped when he saw me. I noticed the warmth of the air for the first time. It was summer here, deep summer, the kind that felt permanent. He was beautiful, that was the only word. A face that reminded me of a certain kind of person I had known, the very ill ones sometimes, who burned with an inner light, a hectic glow that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with fragility. But he stood in the sun and looked at me with something open and unfrightened in his expression. And without entirely deciding to, I took my hands off the machine. Chapter 6, First Contact Protocol. The creature was right in front of me, barely 5 feet tall, delicate as spun glass. It looked up into my face and laughed, not a nervous laugh, not the laugh of something cornered or afraid, a clean, bright laugh utterly without fear. Then it turned and spoke to the two behind it, and the language that came out was like nothing I'd ever heard, liquid, musical, each syllable dissolving into the next like sugar in warm water. Them came. Within a minute, 8 or 10 of these small perfect beings had gathered around me in a loose ring, their wide eyes catching the amber light of the afternoon. One reached out and touched my hand, then another, small fingers at my shoulder, my back. They needed to confirm I was solid, real, that the large, rough-edged thing that had materialized out of the thunderstorm was made of actual flesh. I let them. There was nothing threatening in any of it. They moved with this effortless, childlike grace, so genuinely frail that the thought surfaced, unbidden and almost comic, that I could have knocked the lot of them down like Skittles. Then I saw their hands on the machine, small pink fingers, curious and probing, reaching through the brass fittings toward the control levers. My heart lurched. The levers. I lunged forward, not violently, just firmly, and they scattered back a half step. I reached through the machine's side bars and unscrewed the 2 levers that would set it in motion. Dropped them into my coat pocket. Felt the cold weight of them settle against my thigh. That was close. I forced myself to breathe, turned back to them. Now I looked at them properly, the way you look at something when the immediate crisis has passed and your pulse starts to settle. They were extraordinary, the aesthetic perfection of fine porcelain given breath and motion. Their hair uniformly curly, every one of them came to a precise, clean edge at the neck and jaw. No facial hair whatsoever, ears almost absurdly small, mouths delicate, lips thin and vivid red, chins tapering to a soft point. Their eyes were the strangest part. Large, mild, beautiful, and somehow behind all of that beauty empty, not vacant exactly, just incurious. They weren't studying me the way I was studying them. They stood in their cluster, trading soft sounds with each other, smiling at me the way you smile at something pleasant but not particularly interesting, like a butterfly that has landed on your sleeve. I was the one who had to start the conversation. I pointed at the machine, pointed at myself. Then I tried to gesture at time, at the vast, incomprehensible gulf of years I'd crossed to arrive here, and I pointed at the sun. One of them, dressed in a small checkered tunic of purple and white, watched my gesture, tilted its head, and then opened its mouth and made a sound like rolling thunder. I stood very still. The meaning of the gesture was clear enough. It was asking whether I'd come from the sun, in a thunderstorm. That was the question. That was the intellectual content of it. 802,000 years of human civilization. And this creature, this beautiful, serene inheritor of everything we had ever built or learned or discovered, was asking me if I had ridden a thunderbolt down from the sky. I felt it then, the disappointment. It moved through me like cold water through a crack in stone. I had spent years building the machine, years of calculations, of sleepless nights, of rebuilding and refining and trying again. I had imagined this moment 10,000 times. I had pictured a civilization so far beyond ours that I would arrive here like a savage stumbling into a cathedral, blinking and overwhelmed and small. Instead, I had this. Children, beautiful, gentle, and curious children. I nodded, pointed at the sun. And then I threw my head back and gave them the best impression of a thunderclap I had in me. They startled, all of them stepping back, a ripple of alarm moving through the group, and then they bowed. Then one of them came laughing toward me holding a chain of flowers. I'd never seen flowers like them. The years had done something extraordinary to ordinary blossoms, created shapes and colors and impossible geometries of petal that had no name in any language I knew. The small figure looped the chain over my head, settling it around my neck. That set the rest of them off. They scattered in every direction, laughing, and came back with armfuls of blooms, cascading them over my shoulders, draping them across my arms, until I stood in the afternoon light like some battered, bewildered fertility idol, drowning in color and fragrance. And then, as if a decision had been collectively reached by some means I couldn't observe, they began leading me somewhere, past the white marble sphinx. It sat where it had always sat, I supposed, watching the garden with that fixed half-smile. Untouched and patient through the centuries while everything around it softened and blurred. It seemed to watch me too as I passed, to find something quietly amusing in my confusion. They led me toward a vast gray building, enormous, its stone face covered in carved fretwork that had once been precise and was now eroded into suggestion. I caught what might have been Phoenician decorative motifs in the archway as we passed through it, deeply weathered, badly broken, old, profoundly, unsettlingly old. Inside, A great hall hung with brown fabric, the ceiling lost in shadow. Windows, some still holding colored glass in geometric patterns, others simply open to the air, admitted a soft, filtered light. The floor was massive blocks of some pale metal alloy, worn by the passage of countless feet into deep channels along the main pathways. The grooves were smooth as river stones. How many generations of small, soft footsteps did that take? Stone tables ran in rows, raised just above floor height, their surfaces polished and heaped with fruit. The air smelled like flowers and something else, something ripe and ancient and still. Cushions were scattered between the tables. My guides settled themselves onto them with fluid ease, gesturing for me to join them. I sat, I was thirsty, I was hungry, I ate. Around me, perhaps 200 of these small people dined in the enormous hall, and most of them had arranged themselves as close to me as the space allowed, watching me with those large, mild eyes, the fruit glistening in their hands. I looked at the hall properly as I ate. The stained glass was broken in a dozen places. The curtains at the far end were gray with accumulated dust. A corner of the nearest stone table had fractured off and never been repaired. The brown hangings on the walls were faded to near translucence in places. Everything was beautiful. Everything was crumbling. The whole civilization, if that word still meant anything here, had the quality of something immaculately made and then simply left, like a watch still running long after the watchmaker is gone. This is what 800,000 years of peace looks like, I thought. This is the destination. I ate their fruit. It was extraordinary. Years of cultivation had produced varieties of flavor and texture that had no equivalent in my own century. One in particular, triangular in its husk, flowery and sweet, I kept reaching for without thinking about it. They were strict vegetarians, I quickly understood, all of them. The great arc of domesticated animals, horses, cattle, sheep, dogs, appeared to have vanished entirely, gone the way of the ichthyosaur and the trilobite, consumed by the immensity of elapsed time. I let that settle in my mind and then I set it aside. There was work to do. I picked up a piece of fruit, held it up, began making sounds, interrogative, deliberate, pointing from the fruit to my mouth to my ears, trying to convey the concept of name this thing for me. The first responses were stares, then helpless, delighted laughter. My voice apparently landed on them like something absurdly coarse and oversized, a blunt instrument in a room built for whispers. But eventually one of them, pale-haired and attentive, seemed to understand what I was after. It said a word, a real word, a label. I repeated it badly, more laughter. I repeated it again, better. I kept going, noun by noun, object by object. The language was exquisite and genuinely difficult. The sounds required a precision of mouth and breath that I kept failing and then slowly, incrementally, less failing. By the time the hall began to empty, I had perhaps 20 solid words, a few demonstrative pronouns, the verb meaning something close to eat. It was almost nothing, and the small people were already bored. Their attention spans, I was discovering, were roughly those of cats. They would engage for a moment, bright-eyed, willing, and then something would flicker out behind their eyes and they would simply drift away. Not rudely, not unkindly, just gone the way interest goes when it has never been trained to hold. I would have to learn this language in fragments, in whatever small doses they could tolerate before the effort became more than they wished to give. I watched them go, drifting out into the dying afternoon light, trailing flower chains and soft sounds, their silken garments catching the last of the sun. I sat in the enormous crumbling hall. My pocket held 2 small brass levers. Outside, somewhere in the rhododendrons, my machine sat alone. Chapter 7, Ruins of Tomorrow. The Eloi barely noticed me. That was the strangest thing. At first they'd swarmed around me like children discovering a wounded animal, wide eyes, breathless chittering, small fingers reaching. But children lose interest fast. Within minutes they drifted away, pulled toward something else, something shinier, leaving me standing alone in the vast corridor of that impossible hall as though I'd always been there. As though I didn't matter at all. I let them go. I pushed back out through the great portal into the evening light, hunger finally quieted, mind still racing. The sun was going down, that warm amber collapse of light that makes everything look like a painting, like something already past. The world glowed with it, and it was beautiful. God help me, it was beautiful, this ruined, strange, impossible world. But I needed to understand it. I needed high ground, a ridge maybe a mile and a half distant. I fixed my eyes on it and started walking. The Thames was still there below me, but wrong, shifted a full mile east of where it should have been, a slow band of hammered silver catching the last of the sun. The building I'd emerged from occupied the slope of a broad river valley, its impossible bulk rising behind me like a sleeping giant. Around it in every direction the earth had been surrendered to green. Thick, riotous, glorious green, and threaded through it the ruins. That's what kept snagging my attention. A heap of granite maybe 200 yards up the slope, colossal, the stones bound together with masses of corroded aluminium, Walls collapsed into each other at desperate angles, entire wings of some structure I couldn't name folded down into rubble. Beautiful pagoda-like plants had colonized the wreckage. Nettle-shaped but tinted a deep tobacco brown, and I reached out, pressed my finger to a leaf, completely harmless. Bred that way or evolved that way, I couldn't say. Something had happened here, something enormous and slow and irreversible. I kept moving. The small figures followed me for a while, 6 of them, maybe 7, drifting in my wake like pale satellites, laughing softly among themselves, gesturing at me with something between curiosity and affection. Then one by one they peeled away. I was alone on the hillside, and that's when I noticed. I stopped walking. Turned a slow circle on the terrace where I'd paused to rest. No cottages, no farmhouses, no hedgerows marking the boundaries of someone's land. The English countryside as I knew it, that intricate patchwork of private ownership and village life, the smoke from 1,000 kitchen fires was simply gone. In its place, scattered through the greenery like monuments, the palace structures. Grand, crumbling, magnificent, some occupied, some not. Communism, I thought. The word arrived instinctively, reflexively, and then something else arrived right behind it. I turned and looked at the figures still visible below me on the slope, half a dozen of them moving through the golden light, and I actually saw it this time instead of merely looking. They were all the same, not similar. The same, every soft, hairless face, every rounded, girlish limb. The same draped fabric, the same easy posture, the same luminous vacancy in the eyes. Male. Female, the distinction had dissolved entirely. The children looked like scaled-down versions of the adults, eerily proportioned, precociously formed. How had I missed it? Because everything was strange. When everything is wrong, nothing reads as specifically wrong. Your brain gives up trying to catalog the anomalies and just floats, but now I saw it plainly. I started moving again, climbing toward the ridge. And I turned the observation over in my mind the way you'd turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight and edges. It made sense. Of course it made sense. In our time, the differences between the sexes, physical strength, softness, the hard biological architecture of family existed because they had to. Survival required specialization. A world of constant threat, constant physical demand, required the full toolkit of human variation, but remove the threat. Secure the food, end the violence, the disease, the desperate arithmetic of child mortality. Do all of that completely and permanently, then what are those differences for? They become vestigial, evolutionary deadweight. And over 1,000 years, 10,000 years, nature is ruthlessly efficient at shedding deadweight. The ridge, I finally crested it. There was a bench there, some yellow metal I didn't recognize, pocked with pink corrosion, armrests cast in the shape of griffin heads. Half buried in soft silver-green moss, I sat and I looked. The sun was already below the horizon. The western sky was a wound, gold bleeding into purple, purple into deep arterial crimson. Below, the valley of the Thames caught that dying light and held it, the river a strip of burnished steel between the dark banks. No hedges, no fences, no signs anywhere of proprietary claim, no fields under cultivation. The whole earth, every inch of it visible from where I sat, had been converted into garden, wild and perfect and entirely without purpose. I sat with it, let the full weight of the vista press down on me, and I began to construct a theory. It felt solid, it felt in that golden, ruined, spectacular evening light like truth. Humanity had won, that was the core of it. Simple, enormous, almost incomprehensible. The long war against nature, disease and famine and violence and entropy had been fought to its conclusion. Germ theory accelerated, selective breeding perfected, agriculture, horticulture, sanitation, all the clumsy incremental sciences of my own era taken to their logical terminus. The gnats were gone, weeds were gone. I'd been here hours and seen no evidence of illness, no lesion, no cough, no limp. Even the rot of organic matter, I'd noticed this without fully registering it, seemed somehow reduced, muted, as though decay itself had been persuaded to slow down. Mankind had conquered nature. And then the harvest was what I saw, because here's what nobody thinks about when they dream of utopia. Strength is the product of adversity. Intellect sharpens against the grindstone of necessity. Remove the grindstone and you remove the mechanism that produces the sharpness. Security doesn't maintain the qualities that built it. It erodes them. I thought about that physical slightness, those soft, luminous, empty faces, the way they'd swarmed me and then simply lost interest. The vacant delight, the childlike effect, the total absence of urgency in any movement or expression. I thought about the ruins, big ruins, vast, ambitious. Structurally complex ruins, the bones of a civilization that had required enormous intellectual and organizational force to construct. And the creatures currently inhabiting it couldn't have built a garden wall. The people who built those palaces were gone. What remained were their decorative descendants, living in the shelter of achievements they no longer understood. Physical courage, useless. No predators, no war. Sustained intellectual effort, useless. No scarcity. No competition. The fierce attachments of family, unnecessary. No mortal danger to the young. For countless generations, the traits that had built civilization had simply gone unselected, unrewarded, and slowly, with the patient mathematics of deep time, they'd faded. I looked out at the garden world, the white figures moving through the last of the light like pale flowers. The butterflies, brilliant, improbable, everywhere. Beautiful, I thought. Dying, I thought. The artistic impulse had been the last to go. I could see its final expression in the carved griffins on this bench, in the astonishing architecture now quietly becoming rubble, in the flowers they wove into their hair. Energy, when stripped of all productive outlet, always runs to art first, then to pleasure, then to nothing. Even the flowers in their hair had the quality of something rehearsed, ritual without memory. I felt it then, that specific intellectual vertigo that comes when you think you've finally understood something vast and terrible. Standing there in the gathering dark over the Thames, over the garden, over the beautiful wreckage of everything humanity had worked toward, I thought I had the answer. I thought I had the whole shape of it. I was wrong. I had a corner, a single facet of something with more surfaces than I could yet imagine. But I didn't know that yet, standing there in the dark. I felt the particular, intoxicating certainty of a theory that explains everything it can see, which is, of course, the most dangerous feeling in the world. Chapter 8, Machine Gone Forever. The moon came up full and swollen, yellow as a bruise, flooding the world in pale silver light. I stood on the hill crest and looked down at everything I'd discovered, everything I thought I'd mastered, this future, this strange, soft, impossible future. The triumph of it had been sitting in my chest like a warm coal for hours. Then I looked at the lawn. Something was wrong. The feeling arrived before the thought, a cold pressure behind the sternum. A wrongness I couldn't yet name. The white sphinx stood on its bronze pedestal below me, its leprous face angled away from the slope toward the little patch of open lawn. The silver birch trees, the tangle of rhododendron black against the pale light. I recognized all of it, every detail in its correct position, except one. The time machine was gone. The realization didn't come gently. It hit me like an open palm across the face. My vision went briefly white. The warm coal in my chest turned to ice and dropped straight through the floor of me. They moved it, I thought immediately. Someone pushed it under the bushes. It's there, it's still there. I was already running. The slope was steep and the moonlight was deceptive, flattening shadows, hiding the terrain. I fell hard 20 meters down, face first into the earth, something sharp opening a cut along my cheek. I felt the warm trickle, didn't stop. Was back on my feet before the pain fully registered, running harder, the blood moving down my jaw and dripping off my chin, the whole world narrowing to that single patch of lawn and what wasn't on it. They moved it, that's all. They moved it a few feet. It's there, but I knew better. Even then, gasping, legs burning, I knew the voice in my head was just fear talking. The machine wasn't there. Some part of me had already accepted that, and it was screaming. Think about what the time machine actually is. It's not magic. It's engineering. Brass fittings and crystal rods and a mechanism of extraordinary precision that I'd spent 11 years designing in a workshop that smelled of solder and machine oil. It moves through the fourth dimension, time, the way a locomotive moves through the third, but it is still a physical object. Still a thing made of matter, occupying space, subject to the same forces as everything else in this world. Someone had moved it in space, hidden it, concealed it somewhere in this alien landscape, and without it I was stranded in the year 802-701. The thought hit me like a second impact. I actually stumbled, nearly went down again. No, I covered the 2 miles from the crest to the lawn in under 10 minutes. I know because I was counting my own ragged breaths, trying to hold on to something mathematical, something ordered, while everything else came apart. I hit the open grass and stopped, searched, circled, ran my hands through the rhododendron bushes into the dark spaces beneath them, thorns opening new cuts on my knuckles. Nothing. I dropped to my knees and swept the ground, stood, ran the perimeter again. The Sphinx watched from above, blank-faced and enormous, white in the moonlight, and I had the irrational sense that it was amused. I pressed both hands into my hair and pulled. Gone. It was gone. Here is the physics of my situation, laid out with the cold precision of a man who builds impossible things for a living. The machine cannot move through time on its own. I'd specifically engineered against that possibility. The control levers, when removed, locked the temporal displacement mechanism completely. No tampering could send it forward or backward through time. Someone could only move it through space, through 3 ordinary dimensions, which meant it was close. It was somewhere in this world of the year 802-701 within reach in theory. But I was one man, and this was an unknown world, and the moon kept rising. I don't remember all of it, that's the honest answer. I remember fragments, vivid and sharp, surrounded by long blank spaces. I remember running through the moonlit bushes around the Sphinx, crashing through undergrowth, startling some pale animal, small, white, gone in an instant. I remember finding the great stone building and going inside. The vast hall, dark and hushed, smelling of dust and something floral. I slipped on the floor, went down hard against the edge of a malachite table, and lay there for a moment with real sparks in my vision. I lit a match, moved deeper. I found a second hall. 20, maybe 30 of the small people sleeping on cushions, their delicate faces slack and soft in the sudden flare of firelight. I don't think I handled the next few minutes well. Where is it? I heard myself shouting, reaching down and shaking shoulders, the match in my other hand throwing wild shadows across the ceiling. The machine, where did you take it? Some of them laughed, the ones who didn't look terrified. Something in me recognized even then how it must have looked. This large, bleeding, wild-eyed man from 800,000 years in their past, screaming in a language they'd never heard, waving fire at them in the dark. I dropped the match, walked out. The moon was high now. I raved. I'm not proud of this, but I will not pretend it didn't happen. I moved across that moonlit landscape like something broken, shouting into the empty air, crying, cursing myself, cursing my own staggering arrogance in leaving the machine unattended, as if I were on a countryside holiday and not stranded in a future that regarded me as a curiosity. At some point I was on my knees by the Sphinx, hands flat on the cold, damp grass, forehead almost touching the ground. Nothing left, not even anger, just the hollow, physical weight of absolute wretchedness. I slept there, I don't know when. The despair just switched me off. When I opened my eyes, the sky was gold and blue, and 2 sparrows were hopping in the grass within arm's reach, completely unbothered by my existence. I sat up slowly. My cheek was crusted with dried blood. My knuckles were a mess. My whole body ached like something that had been used hard and put away wet. I sat there in the morning air and let the daylight do its work on me. All right, I thought, all right, think worst case the machine is destroyed. Then I am here permanently and I must learn to build another one. That would take years, it might be impossible. But it is a problem with steps and I know how to work problems. More likely case, the machine was taken and hidden. I need to find it. I need to be calm, methodical, and patient. I need to learn this world's language, earn some measure of trust, and look for clues without tipping my hand. I stood up, brushed off my coat, found I was hungry. Something had changed overnight. The panic had burned itself out completely, and what was left in its place was something harder and more useful. Determination. The particular stubbornness of a man who has spent 11 years in a workshop being told by everyone he knew that what he was attempting was physically impossible. I examined the lawn carefully in the morning light, moving in a slow, methodical grid, and that's when I found the groove. A long scrape in the turf, running from the marks my machine had made on arrival. I could still see the impressions from when I'd wrestled it upright, running directly toward the base of the Sphinx's pedestal. I followed it. The pedestal was bronze. I'd assumed it was solid, decorative, the kind of thing you don't look at too hard because it seems self-evident, but now I ran my hands across it carefully, tapping the surface. The panels on each side were framed, recessed, elaborately decorated. I knocked with my knuckle, hollow. I felt the edges of the nearest panel with my fingernails. No handles, no keyhole, no visible mechanism. But the panel was not continuous with its frame, a seam, invisible unless you were looking for it. A door. My time machine was inside the Sphinx's pedestal. I was almost certain of it. I tried to get help. I really did. 2 of the small people in orange came through the apple trees and I smiled, beckoned them close, pointed carefully at the panels, tried to mime what I needed. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. Their faces, previously open, pleasant, curious, closed shut like doors slamming. They turned and walked away with the specific body language of people who have been deeply, personally offended. I tried 3 more of them over the course of the morning. Same result. Each time, the moment I pointed at the Sphinx's base, something shifted in their eyes. Not fear exactly, more like revulsion, as if I'd done something obscene. On the 3rd attempt, I lost my temper. I'm not proud of this either. I grabbed the man by his robe and dragged him 2 steps toward the pedestal before I saw his face, real horror, genuine distress, and let go immediately. I stood there, breathing hard, looked at my hands. Then I got a river stone and hammered directly at the bronze panels for 20 minutes, the sound ringing out across the lawn in sharp metallic bursts, the verdigris coming off in green powder. I put a visible dent in one of the decorative coils. Nothing. The doors didn't open, and a crowd of the small people had gathered on the hillside, watching me with expressions I couldn't read. At some point I thought I heard something from inside the pedestal, a sound that might have been a chuckle. I stood very still for a long moment with the stone in my hand, then I set it down, sat on the grass, looked at the Sphinx. The Sphinx looked back. Patience, I told myself. If you want the machine, leave the Sphinx alone. Learn the world first. The answer comes at the end, not the beginning. And then, abruptly, the absurdity of my situation caught me completely off guard and I started laughing. Just laughing, alone on the lawn in the year 802, 701, with blood drying on my face and green verdigris on my knuckles. 11 years I'd spent building a machine to reach the future. And now every ounce of my energy was focused on a single, burning need to get back out of it. The most sophisticated trap ever devised by a human mind, and I'd built it myself. Over the following days I worked at the language. It was simpler than anything I'd encountered, almost entirely concrete nouns and basic verbs, no abstraction, no metaphor, sentences rarely longer than 2 words. Whether this represented some fundamental shift in human cognition over 800 millennia, or simply a culture that had evolved beyond the need for complexity, I couldn't yet determine. Either possibility unsettled me in ways I wasn't ready to examine. The small people seemed to forgive my outbursts gradually, or perhaps they simply forgot them. Their relationship with memory seemed different from mine. Within 2 days they were approaching me again, curious and gentle, offering fruit. I was careful now, calm on the surface, patient, underneath, like a compass needle that can't stop pointing north. Every thought I had eventually bent back toward the bronze pedestal and the locked doors and the machine I was certain was waiting inside. I kept that thought in a box in the corner of my mind, took it out occasionally, examined it, put it back, waited. Chapter 9. The breathing dark. The land was extraordinary. Every hill I climbed revealed the same impossible abundance, magnificent structures scattered across the valley like discarded jewels, their materials and shapes varying wildly, their purpose unclear. Thickets of evergreens crowded between them. Blossom-heavy trees arched over ancient paths. Water caught the light and threw it back like hammered silver. In the distance, blue hills dissolved into a sky so serene it hurt to look at. Beautiful, all of it, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. The wells were the first clue I couldn't reason away. They appeared throughout the landscape, circular shafts rimmed with intricately worked bronze, each one sheltered by a small cupola against the rain. I crouched at the edge of one and peered down into the darkness. No water, not even the suggestion of it. I struck a match and held it over the opening. Nothing reflected back, but I heard something. Thud, 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 deep, rhythmic, mechanical, like the heartbeat of some enormous engine buried in the earth. I held my match near the opening and watched the flame lean sideways, a steady current of air pouring down into the shaft. I tore a scrap of paper from my pocket and dropped it into the throat of the well. It didn't flutter. It was snatched, gone in an instant, swallowed by the dark. I stood up slowly. I began to notice the towers next. Tall, narrow structures on the hillsides, and above them, in the blazing afternoon heat, the air shimmered and rippled, the same distortion you see rising off sun-scorched stone. It took me a while to connect them to the wells. But when I did, a picture assembled itself in my mind with the cold, satisfying click of an engineering diagram snapping into focus. Ventilation. An enormous, complex ventilation system. Pushing air down through the shafts, cycling it through something vast and hidden beneath my feet. My first instinct was sanitation. Obvious conclusion. Wrong conclusion. Completely, catastrophically wrong. I should acknowledge something plainly. I understood almost nothing about how this civilization actually worked. The mechanics of it, the logistics. I'd read the utopian literature, those confident Victorian visions of the future, stuffed with meticulous detail about municipal organization and social architecture. But those were fantasies built inside the safe confines of one man's imagination. This was real, and reality, I was learning, is under no obligation to explain itself. Think of it this way. Imagine a man from the remotest interior of Africa transported without warning to London. He walks through the city. He sees the railway. The telegraph wires strung between poles like a vast spider's web. The pneumatic delivery tubes, the postal system. He sees all of it, and he understands almost none of it, not because he lacks intelligence, but because the context is missing. The 10,000 invisible assumptions that hold a civilization together. Now consider the distance between that man and a Londoner of my own era. Then consider the distance between myself and the year 802. 701. There were no crematoria that I could find, no graves, no tombs, no headstones, no charnel houses. Either the dead were disposed of somewhere beyond my explorations, or, and this thought arrived quietly like a stone dropping into deep water, there were simply very few of the Eloi who reached old age. I scanned the faces around me, young, all of them young, soft-featured, gentle, almost luminous with health, not one of them old. Not one of them aged or infirm. My initial theory, automatic civilization, humanity grown comfortable and consequently diminished, was already starting to fracture. It explained some things, not enough things. These people wore clothing woven from fabrics I couldn't identify, fabrics that would eventually wear out and need replacing. Their sandals, though plain, were intricate metalwork. Someone somewhere was making these things, but there were no workshops, no factories, no markets or storerooms or any sign of import or manufacture. The Eloi spent their days in a kind of beautiful, purposeless drift, bathing in the river, eating fruit, sleeping in their magnificent communal halls, chasing each other through the gardens in a slow, dreaming approximation of play. Nothing was being made, yet everything was there, and then there was the time machine. Gone, taken, sealed inside the hollow pedestal of the white sphinx as though it had never existed. Every time I thought about it, something tightened in my chest, a cold, mechanical fear, the fear of a man who has just realized the door behind him has been locked. Who took it? Why? What do they want? The world felt like a sentence in a language I almost spoke. Certain passages were perfectly clear: the trees, the sky, the laughter of the Eloi. Others were gibberish, symbols with no referent, words made of unknown letters. On the third day I made a friend. I was watching a group of Eloi bathing in a shallow stretch of the river, the water golden in the afternoon light, the laughter bright and careless, when one of them got into trouble. A cramp. The current caught her and she began to drift downstream, crying out in a weak, confused way like a child who doesn't quite understand what's happening to her. I looked at the others. Nobody moved. They watched. They didn't look frightened exactly. They looked absent. As though the event was happening at a slight remove from reality, behind glass, not quite their problem. The girl was drowning right in front of them. I was already pulling off my coat. I waded in downstream and caught her, a tiny, weightless thing, and dragged her to the bank. A few minutes of firm attention to her limbs, rubbing the blood back into circulation, and she was breathing normally, her color returning. I hadn't expected gratitude. These creatures seemed to exist below the threshold of that particular emotion. I was wrong about that. She found me that afternoon. I was returning from an exploration of the surrounding hills when she appeared on the path, and the sound she made when she saw me was, I don't have a better word for it, joy, pure and unguarded. She held out a garland of flowers toward me, elaborate and deliberate, clearly made for this specific moment. For me, only for me. Something moved in my chest that I hadn't expected. We sat together in a small stone arbor as the light went amber and long, and we communicated through the only language available to us: smiles, gestures, flowers passed back and forth. She kissed my hands, I returned the gesture. It felt ancient and right. I tried speech. Gradually, painstakingly, I extracted one piece of information. Her name was Weena. I don't know what it meant. It didn't matter. It suited her. That was the beginning of something I hadn't anticipated and couldn't afford. A friendship, 1 week long. It ended in a way I'm not yet ready to describe. She wanted to be with me constantly. She trailed me on my explorations with fierce, exhausting dedication, and on the occasions I had to move faster than she could manage, I would eventually look back and see her small figure sitting in the path behind me, spent, calling after me in a voice that did things to my conscience I'd rather not examine. But the problems of this world were real and pressing. I had not traveled 800,000 years into the future to conduct a sentimental education. Still, her distress when I left her was sometimes frantic, and when I returned, the small white and gold figure of her waiting on the hillside, watching for me, made the approach to the white sphinx feel, against all reason, like coming home. It was from Weena that I learned that fear still existed in the world. In daylight, she was fearless. I tested it once, made an absurd, threatening face at her. She laughed, pure delight, but the dark was different. The dark was something else entirely. She was afraid of shadows, afraid of black spaces, dark corridors, anything that blocked the light. It wasn't ordinary caution, it was visceral, ancient, the kind of fear that lives in the brainstem, below language, below reason. I paid attention. I noticed that the Eloi gathered into their great houses every night without exception. All of them always together, sleeping in warm communal masses. They never went outside after dark, not once. If you entered their sleeping halls without a light, they erupted into immediate animal panic. I catalogued this. I noted it. I completely failed to understand it. Stubborn and oblivious, I continued to sleep apart from the Eloi multitudes, in spite of Weena's increasingly distressed attempts to prevent it. Eventually her devotion overruled her methods, and for 5 of the nights we knew each other, including the last night, she slept with her head on my arm, her breathing slow and even, as though my presence alone was sufficient armor against whatever she feared. It wasn't, but I didn't know that yet. The night before her rescue, which means the night I will describe now, I woke before dawn. I'd been dreaming badly, drowning, something soft and many-fingered moving across my face in the dark. I came awake hard and fast, heart slamming. The room was gray and still, the pre-dawn light turning everything to ash and charcoal, and I had a distinct fading impression, already dissolving as I grasped for it, that something had just left the room. Something pale, something moving low and fast. I lay still for a moment, then I got up. I walked through the great hall, out onto the broad flagstones in front of the palace, and stood in the dying moonlight. The world was colorless at that hour, the bushes black ink, the ground dark gray, the sky the color of old iron, and on the hillside white figures. I saw 3 of them, separate sightings, seconds apart, scanning the slope. The first 2 looked solitary, upright forms, pale as bone, moving with a strange hunched quickness up toward the ruins. The third sighting stopped my breath entirely. 3 of them together, carrying something dark and heavy between them. Then the pre-dawn swallowed them and they were gone. I stood there for a long time, telling myself it was the light, telling myself my tired eyes were assembling shapes from shadows and mist. As the sky brightened and color returned to the world and the hill became simply a hill again with no pale figures anywhere on its face, I almost managed to believe it. Almost. I connected them vaguely to the white creature I'd disturbed during my first desperate search for the time machine. But Weena's rescue pushed everything else aside, and I told myself the ghosts could wait. They couldn't wait. I would understand that soon. The days in this era of 802, 701 were significantly hotter than my own century, hotter than anything in my recorded experience. I've no definitive explanation for it. Perhaps the sun burned with renewed intensity. Perhaps the Earth's orbit had tightened. The astronomers of my own time assume a gradual solar cooling over geological timescales, which is the usual assumption. But there are those, following the younger Darwin's orbital mechanics, who point out something less comfortable, that the planets do not orbit indefinitely. That one by one, over deep enough timescales, they will spiral inward and be consumed. If some inner world had already suffered that fate, the sun would blaze with fresh energy for a time. I think about that now, the idea of worlds falling into the fire. On the 4th day I sought shade inside a massive ruin near the palace where I slept. The building had been extraordinary once. I could see that in the bones of it, the scale and ambition of the stonework. Now it was a landscape of collapsed masonry, tall weeds growing up between blocks of fallen stone, the whole structure slowly, patiently returning itself to rubble. I was clambering through a section of interior corridor when I found a narrow gallery, both end windows blocked by debris, the side windows choked with fallen stone. Coming in from the blinding white glare outside, the interior darkness was absolute. I groped forward, waiting for my eyes to adjust, watching the colors swim and swirl across my vision from the contrast. I stopped, 2 eyes in the darkness, low, maybe a meter off the ground, pale, luminous, catching the faint light from somewhere and throwing it back at me like a cat's eyes in a lantern beam. Something old and deep came alive in my nervous system. The part of the human animal that still remembers, somewhere below consciousness, that the dark is not always empty. My hands closed into fists. I made myself breathe. I made myself think. Humanity is safe here. No predators. The Eloi have no fear of, but the Eloi were afraid of the dark. I stepped forward. I spoke. My voice came out harder than I intended. I reached out my hand and touched something cool skin, a texture like damp cloth, something soft and immediately wrong. The eyes moved. The thing bolted. It ran past me and I spun around to see it crossing a shaft of sunlight outside the gallery entrance, a pale figure, man-shaped but not quite right, head held low and forward, arms slightly extended. It ran like something that had never learned to trust daylight, blundering into a block of granite, staggering, then vanishing into shadow beneath another heap of fallen stone. I stood there for a moment, breathing, then I went after it. I lost it in the rubble. Spent several minutes moving through the deep shadow of the ruin's interior, listening, watching for movement. Then I found one of the circular well openings I'd catalogued earlier, partially obscured by a fallen column. A thought arrived with the force of physical impact. I struck a match and looked down. The creature was there. On the wall of the shaft, descending. Its face turned up toward me, large gray-red eyes, wide and reflective, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. The body pale as tallow, hair the color of old straw on its head and down its spine. Metal hand and foot rests were set into the shaft wall at regular intervals, forming a ladder descending into the dark. The match burned my fingers. I dropped it, struck another. The creature was gone. I sat at the edge of that shaft for a very long time. The truth that assembled itself in my mind was not one I wanted, not one I'd been anywhere near prepared for. I'd understood in the abstract that 800,000 years was enough time for significant change, but understanding it abstractly is different from sitting at the edge of a shaft in the ruins of a civilization and grasping it in your body. Man had not remained one species. The Eloi above, beautiful, gentle, aimless. The things in the dark below, both of them ours. Both of them descended from the same unbroken chain of generations that linked them back through uncountable centuries to me, to my era, to every person I had ever known or loved. 2 species, 1 lineage, 1 irreversible divergence. My mind went to the ventilation shafts, the towers, the thrumming engines beneath the earth, and then, with a horrible, accelerating clarity, I understood what the ventilation was for. I stood up. I looked out at the beautiful valley, the Eloi drifting through their gardens like figures in a dream, and I rebuilt the architecture of this world from the foundations up. It started, I was nearly certain, with something we already had, something I'd watched developing in my own era with the half-interested attention of a man who believes it's someone else's problem. Class, not as philosophy, as engineering. The gradual separation of those who owned from those who labored had been in my own century, already producing its physical consequences. The wealthy were moving above ground, claiming the surface, the parks, the clean air, the light. The workers were moving below it, the metropolitan railway, the underground workrooms, the subterranean factories multiplying beneath London's streets. It seemed efficient, it seemed inevitable. It seemed to the people implementing it like progress. What if it continued? What if it simply continued? The workers go deeper, the factories go underground. The wealthy claim the entire surface of the earth, its light, its air, its beauty, and slowly, generation by generation, the gap between the two populations becomes a chasm. No intermarriage, no exchange, no shared language or experience or common cause. A long time, a very, very long time, the underground workers would adapt. The human body is marvelously, terrifyingly adaptable. Eyes growing large to gather what little light there was, skin losing its pigment in the dark, circadian rhythms inverting, making night the natural element and day an assault. Above ground, the haves freed from all labor, all discomfort, all challenge, drifting slowly toward something that looked like paradise and was actually a kind of managed obsolescence. Shrinking, softening. Great slow unraveling of everything that difficulty had built into the human animal. The triumph I had imagined for humanity, the moral triumph, the cooperative triumph, was not this. This was the other kind, the triumph of logic over mercy, the triumph of efficiency over solidarity. The aristocracy had won completely and finally, and this, the Eloi drifting through their flowering gardens while engines thudded in the deep dark below, was the monument to their victory. But the balance had long since tipped past its peak. The overworlders were in clear decline, smaller, weaker, less intelligent than their ancestors. And the underworlders, I had a name for them now, Morlocks. I don't know where I'd obtained it, perhaps from a gesture of Weena's, a sound, a fragment of their own degraded language. But Morlocks they were, and whatever the Morlocks had become in the dark, I suspected the change was more profound than anything the Eloi had experienced. Then the harder questions arrived. Why had the Morlocks taken my time machine? Because it was the Morlocks, I was certain of it. They'd seen it. They'd come up in the night and taken it and sealed it away where I couldn't reach it. Why? And the Eloi, if they were the masters, if this whole arrangement existed to serve them, why couldn't they simply retrieve it? Why did they go pale and silent when the subject of the underworld arose? Why did Weena go rigid with terror at the very shape of the question? What exactly was the current relationship between the two species? I went to Weena with my questions. She didn't want to answer them. She didn't want to understand them. When I pushed, when I leaned forward and made her look at me and tried, gently at first, then less gently, to get at the thing she knew, her eyes filled. Tears. Real tears, the only tears beyond my own that I witnessed in the entire span of the Golden Age. I stopped immediately. I stopped and sat back and looked at her face and felt something I hadn't expected to feel: shame. I burned a match for her instead, a small conjuring trick, a tiny fire appearing from nowhere. Her tears stopped. She watched the flame with her whole self, completely present, completely absorbed. Within minutes she was clapping her hands, but the questions remained, and now they had a new urgency, a cold metallic edge that the sight of her tears had put there. Because I was beginning to understand that the fear carved into her, that absolute cellular dread of the dark, was not an aesthetic preference. It was a warning, it was a memory, and somewhere below my feet, in the hot, thudding dark of those shafts, something was waiting with the patience of a species that has had 800,000 years to learn how. Chapter 10, Fear Below Ground. 2 days, that's how long I stalled. 2 days of telling myself I needed more information, more preparation, more time, when the truth was simpler and uglier than that. The truth was the Morlocks, their bodies, that fish-belly white, that worm-pale skin, the color of specimens floating in museum jars, the cold of them. I'd brushed against one in the ruins, and the memory of it hadn't left my fingertips. Like touching something that had never once known the sun. I understood now why the Eloi flinched at shadows. The nights weren't helping. I wasn't sleeping. Some formless dread kept pulling me awake, heart hammering at nothing I could name, and I'd find myself moving through moonlit corridors to the great hall just to be near the Eloi, near Weena, near anything warm and breathing. Standing there watching them sleep, I'd do the math on the moon. A few more days and it would pass its last quarter. The nights would go dark, and whatever was coming up from below, those white, eyeless things, those pale replacements for everything that used to be human, they'd come in greater numbers. I knew what I had to do. I'd known it from the moment I understood the time machine was underground. I just couldn't make myself do it, so instead I walked. I pushed my explorations further and further out, southwestward, into the rising country beyond. It was displacement behavior. I recognized it even then. But I kept moving anyway because movement felt like action and action felt like courage even when it was neither. That's when I saw it, far off toward what would have been Banstead in my own century, a structure unlike anything I'd encountered in this world. Vast. The other ruins had a crumbling European dignity to them, all collapsed marble and overgrown granite. This was different. The facade shimmered with the pale blue-green luster of fine Chinese porcelain, enormous and alien against the green hillside, its proportions somehow both monumental and delicate. A palace of green porcelain. The phrase assembled itself in my mind fully formed. I told myself I should investigate immediately. I told myself this was important. I turned around and walked back to Weena. The next morning I sat with the early light falling through broken walls and I looked at myself clearly for the first time in days. The palace of green porcelain was a distraction I had manufactured, another day purchased against the thing I was afraid to do. The time machine was below ground, everything that mattered was below ground, and I was building elaborate reasons to look in every direction except down. I stood up, I went to find a well. Weena found me first, or rather. She never let me get far enough to need finding. She danced at my side through the long grass, light as air, her small hand occasionally catching my fingers. When we reached the well near the old granite and aluminium ruins, I stopped and leaned over the parapet and looked down into the dark. The dark looked back. Weena went still beside me. Goodbye, little Weena. I kissed her, set her down, started feeling along the parapet for the iron climbing hooks. Moving faster than was wise because I could feel my nerves starting to go, the courage draining out through some invisible puncture, and if I stopped moving I would simply stop. She watched me with an expression I hadn't seen on an Eloi face before. Then she cried out a raw, desperate sound and came at me with both hands, gripping my arm, my coat, pulling with everything she had in that small body. I think it was her resistance that saved me. Perversely. Something about being pulled backward made me determined to go forward. I shook her off harder than I needed to and swung my legs over the edge and dropped into the throat of the well. Her face appeared above me, a pale oval against the circle of sky. Her mouth was open. I forced myself to smile up at her. Then I looked down and started to climb, 200 yards straight down. The iron bars were spaced for creatures smaller than me, shorter reach. Lighter weight, and within the first 30 feet my arms were burning. The shaft was absolute black below and absolute shrinking circle of blue above, and the sound rose up from the depths like a physical thing, a rhythmic mechanical thudding that I felt in my back teeth. Halfway down a bar gave, no warning, no creak of metal fatigue. It simply bent under my weight and my hand tore free, and for one enormous moment I was falling, one hand on iron. Body swinging out over nothing, 200 feet of dark below me and the pump sound swallowing everything. I caught myself. I hung there, one-handed, arms screaming, the darkness patient beneath me. After that I didn't stop, couldn't stop. To stop was to think, and to think was to feel my grip loosening, and so I moved hand over hand, rung by rung, even as my muscles went from pain to something beyond pain. Some raw electrical wrongness that radiated up through my shoulders and into my jaw. I looked up once. The opening had shrunk to a blue coin. A single star was visible in it. Weena's head was a small dark shape against the light. Then I looked up again and she was gone. The thudding was enormous now. The air smelled of oil and heat and something older, something organic underneath the metal smell. My eyes were useless. The dark was absolute. The kind of dark that presses against your eyeballs and makes your brain invent shapes to fill the void, and then I saw it. A sliver of dim light. A narrow horizontal opening in the shaft wall, barely a foot to my right. I swung toward it, pulled myself through, lay flat on cold stone. My arms stopped working. I let them stop. I lay in the narrow tunnel and shook. Something touched my face. I came up out of darkness swinging, matches already in my fist. Thumb raking across the striking surface before I was fully conscious. Light. 3 of them, white, stooped, already retreating from the flare, throwing their arms up over those enormous pale eyes. I'd seen deep-sea specimens in glass cases at the Royal Institution, fish pulled from lightless ocean trenches, their eyes evolved into grotesque discs to catch any stray photon in the abyss. The Morlocks' eyes were like that, too large, too reflective. The light caught them and threw it back in opalescent gleams as they scrambled away into the tunnel walls, into cracks and gutters, disappearing like water draining from a surface. But not entirely disappearing. In the dark beyond my small flame their eyes were still there, watching. The match burned out. I tried speaking to them. The sounds they made back at me were nothing like the Eloi's soft vowel language. Whatever these creatures spoke, it had evolved separately in the dark, into something I couldn't parse. I was alone down here in every sense that mattered. I felt my way along the tunnel toward the sound of the machinery. The walls fell away. I struck another match. The cavern was immense. The match's light barely scratched its edges, vaulted stone ceiling vanishing upward into black, machines rising from the floor like industrial monuments, pistons and flywheel and shapes I couldn't name throwing huge angular shadows in every direction. The Morlocks moved in those shadows. I could see them spectral, hunched, sliding between the iron columns. The smell hit me then. Underneath the machine oil and the hot metal and the stale recycled air, something rower, something red, against one wall a table, white metal, laid with food, meat. I stood there with the match burning down toward my fingers, and I looked at the joint on that table and I thought, What animal in this stripped and exhausted future world is large enough to provide that? The match stung my fingers, went dark, the red ember tumbled into the blackness below. I stood in the dark and took inventory, no weapons, no lamp, no medicine. I'd brought nothing useful from my own time. I'd stepped into the machine with the casual arrogance of a man who assumed the future would simply accommodate him. I'd wasted matches showing fire to the Eloi like a parlor trick, watching them flinch and laugh. I'd been profligate and stupid, and now I had 4 matches left and I was standing in a cavern full of things that could see me perfectly. I could feel them in the dark. That was the worst of it, not seeing but sensing. The displacement of air. The soft sounds of movement circling me, the breathing of many small lungs. Something touched my hand, thin fingers, methodical, feeling over my knuckles, my wrist, moving up toward my face. Then I felt the matchbox, being carefully extracted from my grip. I shouted, pure animal reflex. They scattered. I felt the rush of them pulling back, but only for a moment. They came back. They were learning that the sound alone wouldn't keep them off. I heard them whispering to each other, that strange subterranean language, and one of them laughed. An awful sound, high and papery and wrong. I struck a match. The light brought me the tunnel entrance. I moved for it, shielding the flame. Dragging a scrap of paper from my coat pocket to coax another few seconds from the dying light, the flame went out the moment I entered the tunnel. Something blew it out. Then they were on me in the dark, in the narrow space, hands everywhere, pulling, gripping, determined and coordinated in the way of things that have done this before, hauling me backward into the deep. I struck another match, waved it at those faces. Those flat, lipless, chinless faces. Those huge damp eyes, whites showing with shock and reflex, inhuman in a way that hit the gut before the brain could process it. They fell back. I ran, third match at the shaft opening. I lay flat on my stomach, feeling for the iron bars, the pump's vibration thrumming up through the stone and into my chest, hands closed around my ankles. I lit my last match. It went out instantly, but my hands were on the bars. I kicked hard, desperate. Aimed at nothing and connected with something that let go, and I was climbing, pulling myself up through the dark with nothing but the feel of iron and the faint blue ghost of an opening impossibly far above me. They followed for a while. I heard one of them below me, the scrape of it on the bars, and when something closed on my boot and nearly had it before I wrenched free. Then nothing but the climb. 30 feet from the top, my body quit. Not pain, I was past pain. Something more fundamental. The signals between my brain and my hands going soft and intermittent. I clung to the bars with my arms hooked through them and my head spinning, the shaft rotating around me, everything in my body insisting I was falling even when I wasn't. The opening above me was large now, blue and brilliant and unreachable. I climbed the last 20 feet on instinct alone. I got a hand over the lip of the well, then an elbow. Then I was rolling on a broken stone in full sunlight, and the light was unbearable and beautiful, and I lay face down against the ground and breathed. The earth smelled of grass and water and the particular sweetness of things that grow toward the sun. I had been underground perhaps 2 hours. It felt like years. Weena found me, small hands on my face, on my hair, the soft sounds of the Eloi gathering. I heard their voices from somewhere far away at the end of a long corridor, and I followed the sound of them down into the dark. Chapter 11, The Dark Nights. The realization hit me like a fist to the chest. This was worse, far worse than before. Before I'd felt like a man who'd fallen into a pit. Inconvenient, dangerous maybe, but a pit is just geography. You study the walls, you find the handholds, you climb. This was different. Now I felt like something with its leg in a trap, and the hunter was already moving through the trees. The hope I'd been carrying, that frail, essential thing, had just developed a crack I wasn't sure could hold. I told myself the Eloi were simply childlike, naive, that the forces working against me were mechanical, logical, solvable, the kind of problems that collapse the moment you understand them. But the Morlocks weren't a problem to be solved. They were something else entirely. Something that lived in the wet dark beneath the world and looked up at the light with eyes that had forgotten what warmth meant. Something that had kept moving, kept adapting, while the beautiful golden people above danced and forgot and slowly, exquisitely rotted. Instinct told me to run every time I thought of them, not the rational kind of aversion you feel for something dangerous. The older kind, the kind written into the spine, the kind that means this thing will kill you. And it was Weena who'd handed me the piece of the puzzle I'd been missing. She hadn't meant to. Her references to the dark nights had seemed like superstition at first, the babbling of a frightened child afraid of the dark, but she wasn't afraid of the dark. She was afraid of what moved through it, the new moon. I turned that thought over carefully, the way you'd handle something you suspected was loaded. Each night the lunar window was narrowing. Each night the darkness lasted a little longer. Each night the Morlocks had a little more time in which the surface world was theirs. And what did they do with it? I thought about the meat I'd seen underground, the pale, dressed cuts of it on that long table in the dark. I'd noticed it, filed it away, let my mind slide off it like a hand pulling back from something hot. I let it surface now, held it there. My second hypothesis that the Eloi were simply a pampered upper class, still in possession of the earth, still the dominant strain, had been embarrassingly, catastrophically wrong. The real picture was worse and stranger and somehow more logical than anything I'd imagined. Think about what 800,000 years actually means. Not in the abstract way we talk about geological time, waving our hands at numbers too large to feel. Think about it as a machine. A slow, grinding, patient machine that runs on one fuel, pressure. Once maybe it had been simple. The wealthy above ground, living in their marble houses, eating well. Thinking beautiful thoughts. The workers below running the engines, maintaining the infrastructure, their entire existence engineered in service to those above. But pressure doesn't stay contained forever. Generation after generation underground. The gradual dimming of eyes tuned to artificial light. The slow physical restructuring of bodies that never needed to run, never needed to fight, only needed to tend machines in the dark. The intellectual contraction that comes when curiosity has nowhere to go. And above ground, the same process running in reverse. No predators, no hardship, no reason to be anything more than beautiful. The Eloi had become exactly what you'd expect if you removed every selective pressure for intelligence over 50,000 generations. Decorative, gentle, doomed. And the Morlocks had become something that had learned in the absolute dark what hunger really meant. At some point, centuries ago, millennia ago, the food supply had failed. And the Morlocks had looked up at the surface world with those pale, adapted eyes, and they had solved the problem the way any organism solves a resource problem. The meat on the table, I knew what it was now. I knew and I couldn't unknow it, and I sat with that knowledge in my chest like a stone. The Eloi were cattle, beautiful, vacant, golden cattle. The Morlocks clothed them and sheltered them and preserved them, the way any careful farmer tends a herd, not out of residual loyalty, not out of sentiment, out of the same cold logic that tells you not to slaughter everything at once. And the Eloi felt fear they couldn't name or articulate or act on, the way any animal feels the shadow of the abattoir without understanding what an abattoir is. Somewhere in the long ago of human history, one class of people had thrust another class underground and called it civilization. And now, after 800,000 years of patient, lightless evolution, those people were coming back, changed. I thought about Weena sleeping in the crook of my arm and I stopped thinking about it. I needed a plan, concrete steps, something to do with my hands and my mind before the weight of it all became unbearable. 3 things. First, find a defensible position. Somewhere the Morlocks couldn't reach me while I slept, if such a place existed. The thought of them moving over me in the dark while I lay unconscious, pale fingers, those colorless eyes, I killed that thought before it finished forming. Second, fire. They feared light. Whatever deep evolutionary circuit had been burned into them during all those lightless generations, they hadn't overcome it. Fire was a weapon. Fire was a language they understood. Third, get back into that chamber beneath the white sphinx. The time machine was in there, I was certain of it. They'd taken it, stored it, perhaps the way they maintained everything mechanical out of some ancient instinct that had outlasted its original purpose. If I could get inside with enough light, enough force, I could go home. And I was taking Weena with me. That decision had been made somewhere below the level of conscious thought, and I didn't examine it. Some things you just know. The palace of green porcelain. I'd seen its pale pinnacles from a distance on that first afternoon, and something about its scale, its construction, the gleam of dressed stone that had resisted 8 centuries of decay, it had lodged in my memory like a possibility. Now I was committing to it. I shifted Weena onto my shoulder. She was light as a child, as light as something that had never needed density or weight, and I started walking. 7 or 8 miles, I'd estimated. It was 18. My left heel had worked a nail through the sole of the shoe, indoor shoes, comfortable old things I'd been wearing when I made the jump, never designed for this, and every step on that side was a specific, focused misery. The countryside rolled out ahead of us in the long amber light of late afternoon, achingly beautiful, breathtakingly empty. And I moved through it like a man who'd been told the building was on fire, and had decided to walk rather than run because running would mean admitting how bad it was. Weena was delighted to be carried. For a while she rode my shoulder like a ship's figurehead, watching the world pass with those huge liquid eyes. Then she wanted down and she walked beside me, darting away every few minutes to pluck flowers from the verge and stuff them into my jacket pockets. My pockets fascinated her. She decided after much apparent deliberation that they were vases. She wasn't wrong. There's a moment at the end of an English summer day when everything stops. The breeze drops out of the trees. The light goes amber and then gold and then something that isn't quite a color anymore. The air holds its breath. I'd always loved that moment. The sense of the world pausing to consider what came next, walking through it now. With the dark hours closing in ahead of me and the ground feeling hollow beneath my feet, feeling the Morlocks moving under there, patient and numerous, running their machinery and waiting for moonset. That familiar pause felt different. It felt like the moment before the trap springs. We forded a shallow river in the dimness. We passed houses that had gone dark and silent, a headless statue half consumed by vines, a stand of acacias I barely registered. The stars came out one by one above us. Weena's exhaustion had become physical, a heaviness in her small body, and she held my neck with both arms and pressed her face against my shoulder and closed her eyes. I could feel her heartbeat through her ribs, faster than mine. The wood appeared at the crest of a hill, a vast, dark mass spreading left and right without visible end, impenetrable and black. I stopped. I couldn't see the palace from here. I'd lost my bearings somewhere in the last mile. I thought about pushing into those trees. Thought about the canopy closing over us, the starlight gone, every root a potential fall, every shadow its own potential geometry of pale hands and catching fingers. I sat down on the hillside instead. Weena was already asleep against my chest. I wrapped my jacket around her carefully, the way you'd wrap something irreplaceable, and I sat beside her in the open air and I waited for the moon. The stars were extraordinary. Wrong, but extraordinary. Every constellation I'd grown up with had drifted into unrecognizable configurations during the 800 millennia since my departure, that slow procession of the equinoxes, the grinding continental drift of the sky, imperceptible across a human lifetime but absolute across deep time. The familiar shapes were gone. The sky was a stranger's face wearing pieces of a face I knew. The Milky Way was still there. Same ragged arm of the galaxy, same cold fire. That at least was fixed on a timescale that made 800,000 years feel like an afternoon. There was a new star in the south, red, brilliant, brighter than anything I'd known, and one steady planet that watched me like an old friend who decided not to mention how much everything had changed. 40 precessional cycles. That's what the mathematics worked out to. 40 complete wobbles of the Earth's axis. 26,000 years each, stacked end to end. During those 40 cycles, every language I'd ever read, every nation I could name, every piece of music ever written, every war ever fought, every face anyone had ever loved, gone, not destroyed, not even mourned. Just gone the way a wave goes when it reaches the end of the shore, leaving nothing behind but changed geography. And what remained? The Eloi burning through their last evolutionary fumes. The Morlocks. Patient and adapted and inexplicably, terrifyingly purposeful. And me, sitting on a hillside with a borrowed jacket and a broken shoe, holding a creature who was probably going to be eaten if I didn't do something about it. The thought I'd been avoiding climbed back up, the meat on the table. I let myself finish the thought this time. Let myself look directly at it, the way you look at a wound to assess the damage. The Morlocks ate them. They had always eaten them. Or close enough to always that the distinction didn't matter. At some point in the long starvation, rats first, probably whatever vermin lived underground, the calculus had shifted. And why wouldn't it? The prejudice against human flesh isn't instinct, it's culture. It's a learned revulsion specific to a historical moment, and the Morlocks' history had moved a long way past that moment, so they tended their herds. They clothed them and sheltered them and probably in their careful managed the breeding, and the Eloi danced in the sunlight and felt a fear they couldn't explain, and sometimes, on the dark nights, they simply disappeared. I tried to find a scientific distance from it, tried to tell myself these creatures were so far from human that the emotional response was a category error. It didn't work because Weena was right there. Her face white and still in the starlight, her chest rising and falling. Everything in her that was still recognizably human making its quiet argument against my detachment. I couldn't be scientific about Weena, so I watched the stars instead. I held my mind off the Morlocks as firmly as I could, like a hand pressing against a door, and I catalogued the unfamiliar constellations, and I waited. The moon rose late and thin, a bone-white crescent, peaked and pale, offering almost nothing. But it rose. And behind it came the first bluing of the pre-dawn sky, and then the pink, and then the warm gold of actual morning. No Morlocks, not one. The hillside had been empty all night. In the renewed confidence of daylight, with birdsong starting somewhere in the trees below and the air clean and cool, my terror of the night before felt almost theatrical. Almost. I unwrapped Weena from my jacket. She opened her eyes and smiled at me with that absolute, uncomplicated trust that had been breaking my heart for days. My ankle was swollen where the nail had been working at it. I pulled the shoe off, then the other one on principle, threw them both into the long grass. We walked down into the wood. Daylight had transformed it completely. Green and dappled and alive with small sounds, nothing like the black wall of last night. We found fruit, ate, moved through the sun-fractured shadows while other Eloi drifted around us like beautiful, purposeless ghosts laughing at nothing, chasing each other through the light. Not a single thought in any of those golden heads about what happened when the light went away. I watched them. I thought about the meat. I thought about the Morlocks looking up at this, at all this soft, graceful obliviousness with those pale, adapted eyes, and I thought about the word livestock and what it meant, and I thought about necessity. How man had once used that word as a tool, a justification. A comfortable word for I have taken everything from you and called it the natural order, and now necessity had come home. 800,000 years later, but it had come home. I looked at Weena. She was chasing something through the grass, laughing. I looked back at the other Eloi, fatted cattle. The thought arrived clinical and terrible and completely accurate. I killed it, focused on the palace, focused on the 3 steps, focused on the fact that none of this, not the horror of it, not the cosmic justice of it, not the grinding inhuman logic of it, none of it changed what I had to do. Find the palace, make fire, break open that bronze door, go home, take Weena. I kept moving. Chapter 12, Museum of Lost Worlds. The palace of green porcelain rose from the hillside like a dead tooth. We reached it around noon, Weena and I, the sun directly overhead burning white through a sky the color of old brass. It was ruined, gutted. Whatever it had once been magnificent probably was gone. Sheets of green ceramic facing had sheared away from the iron framework beneath, exposing the skeleton of the building like flesh peeled from bone. The remaining glass in the windows was nothing but jagged shards catching the light. The structure had been dying for longer than the word dying could hold. I stopped before entering and looked northeast, my breath caught. Where Wandsworth and Battersea should have been, where I knew those boroughs once existed, there was water, a wide estuary, a gray, glittering nothing where 800,000 lives had once accumulated. I stood there for a moment. A man 800,000 years from his own kitchen, staring at drowned history. A thought surfaced about the creatures in that sea, about what might be living in those depths now, what grotesque evolutionary pressure 800 millennia of unobserved ocean might have produced, and then I pushed it down. I couldn't afford it, not today. I turned back to the building. The material really was porcelain, dense and cold to the touch. The green glaze still vivid beneath the grime in places. Along the facade an inscription ran in characters I had never seen. No alphabet I recognized, no pictographic logic I could untangle. I glanced at Weena. She was watching a beetle navigate a crack in the stonework. "Can you read this?" I asked, and then felt immediately foolish. I gestured at the inscription anyway, pointing, miming reading. She looked at my finger, then at the wall, then back at my face with an expression of absolute comfortable blankness. Writing had never occurred to her, not once, not in her entire life. I kept forgetting she wasn't what she looked like. She looked so human, the way she'd taken my hand that first night, the way she laughed, and she did laugh, this quick bright sound like a struck bell, but it was the affection that did it. Her affection was indistinguishable from what I'd known. It kept tricking me into seeing a person where there was something else, something gentler, something less. The great doors were open, broken, swung wide on corroded hinges. We went in. The hall inside was a gallery, not an atrium. Long and lateral, lit by ranks of side windows that threw pale columns of dusty light across a tiled floor you could barely see. The tiles were buried under centimeters of gray dust that muffled every footstep. Turned the room into a kind of silence I'd never experienced. Not the silence of an empty house, the silence of deep time, the silence of a place that had not been alive for so long that life itself seemed like a rumor. My eyes adjusted, and then I saw it, in the center of the hall, massive, patient, a skeleton, the lower portion anyway. The upper bones and skull had toppled and lay in the thick dust beside it, but the silhouette was unmistakable. I recognized the oblique angle of the feet, the sheer scale of the femurs, Megatherium, ground sloth, extinct since the Pleistocene, or it had been extinct from my perspective. 800,000 years ago, I walked a slow circle around it, my footsteps completely silent in the dust. Where rainwater had found its way through the ceiling over the millennia, it had worn the bones themselves down to nothing, a slow, patient dissolution you could trace with your finger. Further in, filling most of the gallery's back half, the enormous barrel ribcage of a brontosaurus arched up toward the vaulted ceiling. The hypothesis crystallized instantly, clearly, with the particular satisfaction of a correct diagnosis. A museum. I was standing in what had been a natural history museum. This was the paleontological wing of what I was increasingly certain had once been, impossibly, gloriously, the South Kensington complex, the Natural History Museum. 800,000 years old, still standing, still here. I moved to the side walls and cleared the dust from what I'd taken for sloped shelving. Glass cases emerged beneath my hands, familiar as my own laboratory. Most were shattered, their contents already surrendered to entropy. But several, the ones that had remained airtight, the ones where the seals had held against 800 millennia of slow atmospheric pressure, still held their specimens in something close to preservation. Not perfect, nothing here was perfect. The process of decay had slowed dramatically in this era. Bacteria and fungi had largely vanished from the upper world, stripping decomposition of most of its force. But most wasn't all. Even here, even in the cases, time was working. slowly, patiently, with the total confidence of something that never needed to hurry. Among the display cases I found evidence of the Eloi, fossils pulled from their mounts and rolled across the floor. A trilobite strung on a reed like a bead, the casual, uncomprehending vandalism of a species that had lost the concept of significance. The Morlocks had been here too. Several cases had been removed entirely. The heavy ones, the ones that required organization, planning, physical effort, I filed that away. Weena had found a sea urchin somewhere. She was rolling it down the angled glass face of an intact case, watching it with total absorption. The way a child watches a spinning top. She looked up and caught me staring at the room, at all of it, at 800,000 years of accumulated loss. She came to me quietly, took my hand, stood beside me. I didn't move for a long moment. There was more. Of course there was more. A building this size, I'd been foolish to think it was just one gallery. I began to move with purpose. A transverse gallery ran perpendicular to the first. Minerals, a beautiful collection. The specimens strangely well preserved behind their thick glass. My eye snagged on a large block of sulfur, deep yellow, crystalline, almost luminous in the gray light, and my mind immediately went to gunpowder. Sulfur, carbon, saltpeter. I searched the cases methodically. Sulfur I had, carbon I could source, but saltpeter, potassium nitrate was simply gone. Every nitrate compound in the building had deliquesced over the ages, dissolved by atmospheric moisture across spans of time that made the concept of centuries feel quaint. Nothing remained but faint discoloration on the case floors where the crystals had once sat. But the sulfur stayed in my mind, a thread I kept pulling. I moved on. A natural history aisle, or what had been one. Everything recognizable was gone. Taxidermied animals reduced to black, shriveled fragments. Spirit jars containing nothing but brown sediment where specimens had once floated. A drift of dark powder along one shelf that I eventually understood had been an entire collection of pressed plants. Gone, all of it gone. The patient inventory of the natural world assembled over centuries by people who believed knowledge was permanent. I kept moving. The next gallery stopped me in my tracks. It was enormous. Larger than anything I'd yet seen in the building. And unlike the sunlit sections I'd passed through, this one was dim. Profoundly dim. The floor sloped downward at a shallow angle from where I'd entered, or perhaps the hill rose outside to meet it, burying the lower windows progressively deeper. White glass globes hung from the ceiling at intervals, the remnants of some electrical or gas lamp installation, most of them cracked or smashed entirely. The light that remained came only from the high narrow windows behind me, and in that light, on both sides of the central aisle rose machines. Big ones, complex ones. Corroded and broken, most of them seized with rust and the slow violence of time, but some still largely intact. Gears the size of carriage wheels. Shafts of some dark metal I couldn't immediately identify. Housings that suggested pressure or rotation or the conversion of force in ways I couldn't immediately decode. I know my limitations, I know my strengths. And machinery, even machinery 800 millennia beyond my frame of reference, machinery I understand. The language of mechanism doesn't age the way languages do. The principles are eternal: force, motion, conversion, output. I began to move through the gallery slowly, reading each machine, assembling hypotheses. If I could understand what these had done, perhaps I could understand what they could do. Perhaps I could find something useful against the Morlocks. A weapon, a tool. An advantage. I was deep in concentration when Weena pressed suddenly against my side. Hard, urgent, I looked at her. Her eyes were moving toward the far end of the gallery, downslope into the darkness where the floor descended and the windows gave out entirely. I followed her gaze. The darkness down there was absolute, thick and total and seemingly solid, and in that darkness a sound, soft, rhythmic, a pattering of small feet on stone. The same sound I'd heard rising from the ventilation shafts. The same sound that had been following me in one form or another since I first understood what the world had become. Morlocks, how many I couldn't tell. The acoustics of the gallery played tricks, but the footprints in the disturbed dust, small, narrow, too many to count at a glance, told me enough. The machines suddenly held no interest whatsoever. I grabbed Weena's hand and turned, then stopped. One of the machines near the entrance had a lever projecting from its housing. Long, iron, solid, roughly the dimensions of a weapon. I released Weena's hand. She made a small sound of protest, not quite a word, more a tone, the sound of something frightened that doesn't have language for fright, and I held up one finger. Wait. I climbed onto the machine's base, gripped the lever with both hands, and put my full weight sideways against it. It held. Then it resisted. Then, with a sharp iron crack that echoed through the gallery and sent the pattering sounds briefly into silence, it snapped clean off the housing. The weight of it in my hands was immediately right. The balance, the heft, a mace, crude, effective. I dropped back down to the floor and took Weena's hand again. She'd been whimpering in the center of the aisle during those few seconds alone, and she pressed close to me now with a trembling intensity that I found, despite everything, deeply moving. I wanted to go down into that darkness. I want to be honest about that. I wanted to walk down that slope and find whatever was making those sounds and end it. Something cold and tight had been building in me since the night the Morlocks first laid their hands on me in the dark, and it wanted out. But the time machine, that was the only thought that stopped me. If I went hunting and the Morlocks heard the fracas and reached the machine before I could, I turned us toward the door. Mace in one hand, Weena in the other. The next gallery had once been a library. I understood this slowly, the way you understand something that doesn't want to be understood. The brown tatters hanging from the walls and shelving units, I'd taken them for cloth at first, for old flags or pennants, were books, what was left of books. The paper had gone to nothing centuries or millennia ago. What remained were warped boards, cracked metal clasps. The iron and bone architecture of volumes whose entire content had dissolved into the gray general dust under our feet. I stood in the ruins of everything anyone had ever written down. If I'd been a different kind of man, I might have found that profound, poetic. Instead, I thought immediately, specifically, painfully of my 17 papers on physical optics, of the philosophical transactions, of the particular intellectual vanity of thinking that published work constitutes a kind of permanence. I kept walking. The chemistry gallery stopped me. It was on an upper floor reached by a broad staircase, and unlike nearly everything else in the building, large portions of it were intact. The roof had held mostly. The cases had sealed properly. The specimens had been isolated from the slow erosion of open air. I went to every case, quickly but carefully, reading labels where they existed, where the ink had held on cards inside sealed glass, looking for anything reactive, anything energetic, and then a small wooden box inside a truly airtight case, the kind of case whose seal had held against 800,000 years of patience. I smashed the glass. The box opened easily. Matches, phosphorus matches, a full box of them. I took one between my fingers, careful, and struck it against the box's striking surface. It caught, clean and immediate, a small, perfect flame, not damp, not degraded. The airtight case had preserved them with a totality that was almost miraculous. The chemistry still worked. 800 millennia later, the chemistry still worked. I looked at Weena. Dance, I told her in the Eloi syllables I'd been accumulating. I said it again, gesturing, demonstrating, a grown man shuffling his feet on the dusty floor of a ruined museum while holding a lit match. She stared at me. Then she understood, or understood something, understood the mood if not the cause, and she laughed that bell-struck laugh and began to move in the unself-conscious swaying way of the Eloi, and I danced with her there in the dust, badly, enthusiastically, whistling the land of the Leal while the last of the match burned down to my fingers. Fire. I had fire. Against creatures that feared light, that fled light, that retreated from every lamp and flame I'd ever produced. I had the only weapon that mattered. I kept searching. There was more to find, there had to be, and there was. In a sealed jar, buried in a case of preserved chemical specimens, I found camphor. I recognized the smell the instant I broke the glass, unmistakable, clean, sharp. The jar had been sealed hermetically by chance or by care, and in that accidental preservation, a volatile compound that should have evaporated ages ago had survived intact, perhaps across thousands of centuries. It reminded me of something I'd once read about: ink extracted from fossilized belemnites, squid relatives dead for hundreds of millions of years, their sepia still chemically functional. Chemistry persisting through spans of time that humiliate every other human framework for meaning. Camphor burned brightly and well. I put it in my coat pocket. Further on, a long gallery of weapons. Stands of arms, rifles, pistols, swords, hatchets, arrayed in military rows, most of them fused into solid rust. Some, made of alloys I didn't recognize, were still sound, still functional looking, but the ammunition was gone. Every cartridge, every powder charge, reduced to a fine rust-brown dust that shifted when I moved the cases. Useless. I stood for a moment holding a rifle that would never fire again and tried not to feel too specifically sorry about it. I kept the iron mace, left the sword. The crowbar I'd brought from earlier would be more useful against those bronze doors than any blade. One corner of the weapons gallery was scorched and shattered, spontaneous detonation of old munitions, I guessed, at some point deep in the intervening centuries. A controlled explosion that had occurred with no one to observe it, in an already ruined world leaving nothing but char. I found idols from a dozen dead civilizations. Polynesian, Mexican, Greek, Phoenician. Figures in stone and bronze and clay, clustered together on shelves that had held them through the entire collapse of the world that created them. On impulse inexplicable but irresistible, I took out a pen and wrote my name on the nose of a steedite figure from South America. Something about the gesture felt important in a way I couldn't articulate. Evidence I was here, as if that mattered, as if anything I scratched into stone would last longer than the books that had crumbled to dust downstairs. Maybe it would. Stone was patient, the afternoon was thinning, the light in the upper windows had shifted from white to amber. I was moving faster now, still searching but aware of the clock, aware of what came with darkness. 2 more galleries, long, ruinous. The exhibits mostly beyond identification. And then a tin mine model, and beside it, in a sealed case behind thick glass, 2 dynamite cartridges. I shouted, actually shouted, smashed the case with the butt of the mace and grabbed them and stood there for a moment with my hands shaking, running calculations. The bronze doors of the Sphinx, the Morlocks on the other side, my time machine. I found a small side gallery, set both cartridges in a far corner. Retreated to the gallery entrance and waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing. I walked back, picked one up, examined it, and understood slowly and completely and with a depth of deflation that I felt physically in my chest. Dummies, display models, inert resin and painted casing. I set them down carefully and stood there for a moment. And then I thought about what I'd actually been planning to do: rush back to the Sphinx, blow the doors, blow everything, destroy. Quite possibly my only path back to my own century in a fit of tactical impatience. The dummies had saved me from myself. I breathed out, picked up the mace, kept moving. Near the building's center, through an arch I'd almost passed, there was a small open courtyard, turfed, actual grass, green and alive, a private rectangle of living world entirely enclosed by the palace walls. 3 small fruit trees, a stone bench colonized by moss. We stopped, sat, ate what the trees offered, which was small and sweet and not quite anything I had a name for. The sky above the courtyard was going gold. I sat with Weena leaning against my arm and I took stock of what I was carrying: an iron mace, a jar of camphor, a box of phosphorus matches, an iron crowbar waiting back at the hill. Not an army, not a plan, but more than I'd had this morning. The fire was the thing. The fire changed everything. The Morlocks owned the dark, but the dark could be taken from them. A fire in the open tonight would give us safety, and in the morning I would go back to the Sphinx with the crowbar and the mace and whatever understanding I'd accumulated, and I would get back what was mine. The bronze doors had never actually looked that strong. I'd been hesitating, I could admit that now, because of what might be on the other side, the unknown in the dark, the sound of soft pattering feet. But I had fire now, and fire, in this world, was the only thing the dark was afraid of. Chapter 13, The Burning Retreat. We hit the palace doors running. The sun was bleeding out on the horizon, maybe an hour of light left. I had one goal: reach the White Sphinx by dawn. Between us and safety lay the forest, the same forest that had stopped me cold on my last attempt. I needed fire, I needed distance, I needed to not think about what was behind us in the dark. As we walked, I stripped the landscape of anything that would burn: dead grass, brittle sticks, anything dry. My arms filled fast, and Weena stayed close against my side, her small fingers wrapped around my sleeve like the contact was the only thing keeping her alive. Maybe it was. We moved slower than I'd planned. The fuel weighed more than I'd expected, and Weena was exhausted. I could feel the sleep pulling at me too, that deep narcoleptic gravity that comes when your body has simply had enough. 2 days without rest. A full night burning after that. My eyes felt like sand-filled machinery. My nerves were firing wrong. I'd been awake so long I was starting to hallucinate the edges of things. Full dark came before we reached the tree line. At the forest's boundary, Weena locked up. She stopped dead and pressed herself against me, trembling, staring into the black wall of trees with those enormous eyes that saw too much and understood too little of what was wrong. I should have listened to her. I didn't. Some deep animal warning was firing in the back of my skull, the primitive circuitry that evolution built in to keep things alive, and I was ignoring it completely. I know that now. I knew it then, somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the fever logic. I pushed us forward, then I saw them, 3 shapes, low to the ground, crouched in the darkness behind us among the black brush, almost invisible, pale smears of motion against the night. Morlocks, watching, waiting, calculating. The forest ahead was perhaps a mile across. On the other side, open hillside, high ground, defensible. If I could thread through the trees while keeping light ahead of us, we had a chance. But I was holding a load of firewood. I couldn't strike a match with my hands full. I set the wood down, and then the idea hit me, the idea that felt brilliant in the moment and was, in fact, catastrophic. I would light it, light the pile right there. Let it blaze behind us as a barrier. Cover our retreat with fire. Think about what fire means when mankind has forgotten it. This far into the future, lightning still splits trees and scorched them black, but it almost never births sustained flame. Rotting vegetation fermented and smoldered sometimes in summer heat, but actual fire, propagating, climbing, consuming, that was something this world no longer produced. The art of making it had vanished from human memory the same way so many other things had vanished, slowly then completely. Weena had never seen flame in her life. The match head kissed the striker. The spark caught. The pile of dead grass and sticks erupted into a column of orange and gold, and Weena lunged toward it with pure joy on her face, the instinctive, terrified delight of a child encountering something magnificent and lethal. I grabbed her. She fought me. She wanted to touch it, run to it, throw herself into that beautiful, terrible light. I locked my arm around her waist and plunged us both into the trees. Behind us the fire found the grass, found the adjacent brush, spread wide and started climbing the hill in a slow curved line like a burning signature. I laughed, I actually laughed. Then the darkness of the forest swallowed us whole. Weena clung to me so hard I could feel her heartbeat through my coat. The trees were dense and the dark between them was absolute. Overhead, black sky visible only in thin fragments where the canopy broke, cold remote pieces of blue scattered like something shattered. Enough ambient glow from our fire behind us to navigate by barely, picking through the trunks with my iron bar in my right hand and Weena carried tight against my left arm. I heard nothing at first, just my own breathing, my boots cracking through dead leaves. Pulse in my ears that sounded in the silence like something following. Then the pattering started, soft, rapid. Behind me, I moved faster. The pattering matched my pace, then began to close. Then the sounds, those soft cooing and human vocalizations like something that had learned language from a broken recording, layered now into a chorus, surrounding a tug at my coat, fingers on my arm. Weena went rigid in my grip, then completely limp, not unconscious, not yet. Just frozen with terror so total it had overridden her nervous system. Match, I needed a match, but to strike one I needed a free hand. I set Weena down in the dark. Immediately the sounds converged. I heard nothing from Weena, she made no sound at all. But around my knees the Morlocks moved in absolute silence, soft pale hands sliding up my coat, trailing across my back, brushing my neck. Like something that hunted in perfect darkness for 1,000 generations and had shed the need for noise entirely. I found the box, struck the match. The flare punched through the dark and the Morlocks scattered, white backs disappearing between the trees, fast and fluid, there and gone. I had maybe 30 seconds. I pulled a block of camphor from my pocket. Camphor burns hot, burns long, gives off light you can navigate by, not just warmth. A crude lamp. Primitive and imperfect, but all I had. I looked down at Weena. She was face down at my feet, not moving. Her hands were curled against the dead leaves, fingers slightly open, and her breathing, if she was breathing at all, was invisible. Cold shot through me, sharp and total. I dropped to one knee, struck another match, got the camphor lit, flung it to the ground where it bloomed into a chemical blue-white flare that pushed the dark back 20 feet in every direction. The Morlocks peeled away from the light like shadows with mass. Behind the trees, the sound of a crowd, dozens of them. The murmuring multiplied. I lifted her, put her on my shoulder, stood up, and in the process of fighting off the Morlocks, striking matches, checking Weena, dropping her, picking her up in all of that desperate spinning chaos, I had rotated myself multiple times without tracking it. I had absolutely no idea which direction led out of the forest. For a moment I just stood there. The camphor hissed in the dark at my feet. Weena lay motionless on my shoulder. The Morlocks murmured in the trees like a crowd waiting for something. My chest went cold, colder than the night. If I walked toward the palace, I was dead. If I walked in circles until the light ran out, I was dead. Decision point, right now, make a fire, hold position, wait for dawn. I put Weena down on the curved surface of a tree root, gently, like putting down something that might shatter. Got the camphor burning again as the first block guttered out, started gathering. Leaves, branches, anything within arm's reach, moving fast, not leaving the light circle, watching the tree line where pairs of eyes caught the camphor glow and reflected it back at me, ember orange and perfectly round. Then the camphor went out, darkness. I struck a match and immediately two pale forms scrambled back from Weena's body. They'd been right beside her. Hands out, and one of them was so disoriented by the sudden light that he ran directly at me. I felt the impact of the iron bar in my hands transmit up through his bones. The sound he made was not human. He went down. I got another camphor block burning and kept gathering wood. 40 minutes of work, maybe more. A proper fire now, not just camphor, green wood and dry mixed, smoking badly but sustaining. The camphor I could ration. In its light I turned back to Weena, knelt beside her, tried everything I could think of to bring her back. Nothing. I could not determine if she was breathing. I sat down. The smoke from the fire shifted and came toward me, heavy and resinous. The camphor vapor was already in the air, thick and sweet and slightly narcotic. I was beyond exhausted. The forest had gone quiet in that strange way that in retrospect was not quiet at all. I sat down to rest for a moment. Just a moment, my eyes closed. When they opened, there was no fire, only darkness and hands, dozens of hands. I thrashed upright, throwing them off, drove my hand into my coat pocket for the matchbox. Gone, gone. The Morlocks pulled me down. I went to the ground with the weight of them on top of me, soft bodies and needle fingers and that cooing sound rising around me like something ecstatic. The smell was overwhelming, organic, damp. The smell of things that live deep and never see light. I felt teeth at my neck, small and precise and absolutely intentional. My hand hit the iron bar, something ignited in my spine. I came up swinging. The bar connected with faces, shoulders, whatever was closest. I could feel through the metal the specific, awful feedback of cartilage giving way, of bone fracturing. I didn't stop. I got my back against a tree and swung in wide arcs. And the Morlocks screamed and fell back. I stood there, chest heaving, iron bar up. Silence. Then the sounds again, rising in pitch, frenzied, but none of them came at me. They were moving around me, around and past, streaming in one direction. I could hear them retreating, running. Why were they running? The darkness was changing, very slowly. A reddish quality entering the air between the trees. Smoke smell, not camphor, something larger and more catastrophic. Then I understood. I looked back through the black columns of the trees and saw it. The forest was on fire. My fire, the one I'd lit at the tree line to cover our retreat, had spread. Over the course of our entire nightmare passage through the woods, it had climbed and consumed and followed us like a living thing, and now it was here, vast and absolute, a wall of yellow and orange and white that was devouring everything in its path. The Morlocks weren't surrounding me. They were fleeing past me. I looked for Weena. She was gone. I ran. The fire moved faster on my right flank than I could match, cutting off my path, forcing me left, then left again. Heat pressed against my face like a physical thing. Embers dropped through the canopy and landed on my coat, and I beat them out without slowing. The explosive crack of each new tree reaching ignition point hit like a percussion weapon, concussive, directional, intimate. Then the trees broke apart and I stumbled into open space. A Morlock blundered out of the smoke beside me, ran past me without registering I existed, went straight into the fire. I stopped, stared. The clearing was lit like noon. In the center, a low hillside, a natural mound topped by a scorched hawthorn. Around the entire perimeter of the clearing, the forest burned, a complete circle of fire, every angle sealed. And on the hillside, 30, 40 Morlocks, moving in a way I had never seen before. Blundering, helpless, stumbling into each other, falling, rising, one of them pressing its face against the blackened bark of the hawthorn as if trying to hide inside it. The firelight that I had come to depend on for survival was for them an annihilating weapon. They were creatures of permanent darkness. Their eyes, adapted over uncountable generations to the absolute black of their underground warrens, were being destroyed by the light. Not figuratively, literally. I hit several of them with the bar before I understood this. Fear is its own logic, and for a moment I was operating purely on fear logic, swinging at anything that approached. Then I watched one of them stumbling with its arms out, head tilted back, mouth open, making a sound that was, whatever else it was, undeniably the sound of suffering. I lowered the bar. They couldn't see me. They could barely see anything. I walked among them on the hillside, and they moved around me, through me almost like I was a ghost. When one of them lurched directly into me, I sidestepped, and it fell and got up again and kept going in whatever direction its ruined sense of navigation told it to follow. I looked for Weena everywhere in that terrible burning light. I walked the hillside twice, 3 times. She wasn't there. I knew what that meant. I knew and would not let myself think it directly. Would only allow it to exist at the edge of cognition as implication. I sat on the summit of the mound. Around me, blind Morlocks stumbled through their agony. The fire encircled everything in a perfect wall of amber and white. Above it all, visible through rents in the billowing smoke, the stars, remote and indifferent, belonging to a sky that had no knowledge of and no concern with anything happening beneath it. 3 times I watched a Morlock walk directly into the fire. They did it with something that looked from a distance like purpose. I sat on that hill for the rest of the night. I bit my own hand until I tasted blood, trying to convince my nervous system that I was awake. I beat the ground with my fists. I got up and sat down and got up again. I screamed once, short and hoarse, into the smoke, and nobody and nothing answered. What can I tell you about that night that language is built to carry? There are experiences that exceed the structural capacity of narrative, that do not fit inside the architecture of before and after, cause and effect, that simply exist as a weight inside the person who survived them. I will only say I was there, and eventually dawn came. The fire subsided with the last of the dark, and the smoke thinned, and the pale gray light of early morning came through the branches, and the Morlocks, fewer now, much fewer, were still moving but without energy. Slow and purposeless, like something running out of whatever had been sustaining it. I searched the hillside one last time for Weena. She wasn't there. Her body was somewhere in the forest, in the fire. There was a logic to that I forced myself to accept. The fire had taken her, but it had also taken what the Morlocks had intended for her. One horror preventing a worse one. I told myself this. I told myself it mattered. I stood on the summit of that burned and smoking island and looked through the haze until I found it, the silhouette of the palace of green porcelain on the horizon. I took my bearings from that, fixed the direction of the white sphinx in my mind. Then I began to walk through the ash, through the black and smoking pillars of destroyed trees, still pulsing with interior fire, heat radiating from them in sheets. My feet wrapped in grass, left prints in the gray powder that vanished behind me in the light wind. I was alone in a way that has no word, not solitude, not isolation. Something more complete than either, the specific aloneness of being the last coherent thing remaining in a landscape of ruin. I thought of my house, my fireplace. the faces of the people who would be sitting around it, some of them here in this very room now, and the longing that came with those thoughts was a physical sensation. Like pressure on the sternum. Keep walking, just keep walking. And then my hand went into my trouser pocket, reflex automatic, the habit of anxiety, and touched something small and dry, loose matches, half a dozen of them scattered at the bottom of the pocket. The box had been leaking the whole time before the Morlocks took it from me. I stood there in the ash and the morning light and the silence of that ruined forest and closed my fingers around those 6 small sticks. I was not without fire. I started walking again. Chapter 14. The comfort trap. The seat was cold beneath me. Yellow metal, tarnished and ancient, and I'd sat in this exact spot 8 days ago believing I understood everything. I hadn't understood anything. Below me the valley spread out in the early morning light, river silver and slow, the air thick with the scent of blossoms, the impossible architecture of the Eloi's palaces catching the sun like fever dreams cast in stone. Beautiful, heartbreakingly, catastrophically beautiful. And threading through those gardens, those laughing, languid people in their silk robes, drifting between the trees the way dandelion seeds drift, purposeless and perfect and utterly doomed. I watched them. My chest felt hollow. Some were bathing near the river, the exact spot where I'd pulled Weena from the water, and something sharp and hot moved through my sternum when I saw that. I pressed it down, couldn't afford it, not now. Rising from the green like black tumors, the cupolas, the entrances to the underworld. I finally understood what they were, what they meant. Here is what humanity had accomplished in 800,000 years. It had solved every problem, poverty, hunger, inequality, the crushing anxiety of want, all of it gone. The wealthy man had his security, the worker had his dignity. For 1,000 generations, perhaps more, there had been no suffering worth naming, no unemployment, no war, no unsolved social question, and from that perfect equilibrium that achieved utopia, this. The Eloi bright and empty as soap bubbles, the Morlocks grinding in the dark. I sat with that thought, turned it over. Here is a truth I believe we overlook. Intelligence is not a gift, it is a response. A scar tissue the mind grows around danger, around change, around the relentless friction of a world that won't accommodate you. Take away the friction, take away hunger, threat. Necessity, the cold night, the rival, the problem with no solution, and you take away the pressure that makes minds sharp. An animal in perfect harmony with its environment doesn't think. It doesn't need to. It simply is like a gear meshing with a gear, frictionless and precise and incapable of surprise. The Eloi had reached that state, and so they drifted, softened, dissolved back into something that wore a human face without requiring a human mind. But the Morlocks still worked machinery. And machinery, even simple machinery, even automated machinery, still asks something of you. Still presents a problem occasionally that habit alone can't solve, so they retain something. Some faint residue of initiative, of cunning. And when their food supply failed, when the ancient systems that had fed them from above finally, after millennia, began to break down, Mother Necessity came back. She always comes back. So they'd looked up through their tunnels at the pale, sweet, helpless things who'd once been their masters, and they'd adapted. I sat with that too in the warm sunlight and felt the weight of it settle into my bones. 800,000 years. The long, slow arc of every civilization we'd ever built, every idea we'd ever believed in, every sacrifice anyone had ever made for the sake of a better future. And it had come to this feeding arrangement in the dark. I'm not sure when I fell asleep. Exhaustion has a way of ambushing you when the adrenaline finally drains. The sun was warm, the view was peaceful. The grief was heavy enough to press me down. I slept. When I woke, the sun was sinking. I lay still for a moment listening, nothing but wind and distant birdsong. The Morlocks were creatures of darkness. I had time. I stood, stretched the deep ache out of my spine and took stock. Crowbar in my right hand, matches in my left pocket. The levers, the critical, irreplaceable levers in my right pocket pressing against my hip like a secret. I started down the hill toward the white sphinx, then I stopped. The bronze doors were open. I stood at the base of the pedestal and stared. Those massive valves, the ones that had defeated me completely, that I'd spent days trying to crack open with fire and iron, had simply slid down into their grooves, retracted, waiting, an invitation. I didn't move for a long moment. Something cold moved up the back of my neck. Inside, the chamber was small. Stone floor, low ceiling, the smell of machine oil sharp and mineral in the enclosed air. And there on a raised platform in the corner, the time machine. They'd cleaned it, oiled it. I could see in the lamplight that they'd even partially disassembled it. Gentle, curious Morlock hands picking apart the mechanism, trying to understand, before reassembling it with surprising care. I reached out and touched the brass fittings. Something eased in my chest. The levers were in my pocket. I had everything I needed. All my elaborate preparations, the crowbar, the matches, the campaigns I'd planned in my head like a desperate general, and they'd simply left the door open for me. The trap was so obvious I almost laughed out loud. I suppressed it, stepped forward, began fitting the levers to their positions. The panels came down like a guillotine, clang, darkness, total. Immediate, absolute. I smiled, reached into my pocket for the matches. I needed 30 seconds, fit the remaining lever, pull it over, and I'd be gone. I'd dissolve out of their reality like a ghost, like a bad dream, and they'd be left standing in the dark with empty hands. My fingers found the matchbox. I struck the match, nothing, struck it again, nothing. The box, the matches only lit on the box. Of course they did, of course, in the suffocating dark. Heart now hammering in my throat, I tried to orient the match against the striking surface by feel alone. I heard them, close, very close. The soft murmur of their voices, almost playful. One of them touched my arm. I swung the levers like a club, connected with something solid in the dark, heard a sharp intake of breath. Scrambled for the machine, found the saddle, hauled myself up, hands everywhere. Small hands, stronger than they should have been, fingers finding grip in my collar. My coat, my hair, they were laughing, that horrible, murmuring, breathless laugh. I fought, both hands working, one clawing at the levers, trying to fit them by pure feel and desperate instinct, the other swinging, shoving, tearing hands away from my body. One of the levers slipped from my fingers entirely. I heard it clatter against the stone. I headbutted the dark, felt skull against skull, a hard, bright pain that lit the inside of my eyes white. Found the lever. The hands were relentless, patient, and relentless in the way that only things without fear can be, fingers prying at my wrists, at the machine's controls, at everything there. The lever seated. I felt the click of it, the rightness of it. I pulled. The hands fell away all at once, as if severed, like cut rope. The darkness thinned, then dissolved, gray light, the familiar roaring silence of the time stream. I was moving, I was free. Chapter 15, Terminal sun rising. The sickness hits before anything else. That bone-deep wrongness. The nausea that starts in your stomach and radiates outward until your teeth ache with it. I know this feeling. I've cataloged it, studied it, made my peace with it. But this time is different. I'm sideways on the saddle, completely exposed. One hand locked around the brass housing, knuckles white. The other grasping nothing but displaced air as the machine bucks and shudders beneath me like something alive and angry. The world outside the oscillating frame has dissolved into that familiar gray pulse, day, night, a stroboscopic drumbeat of centuries collapsing into seconds. I don't know how long I hold on before I think to check the dials. When I do, my stomach drops through the floor of reality. The thousands of days hand is spinning, not ticking, spinning. Like the second hand of a pocket watch caught in a fever dream, I stare at it and the number assembles itself in my mind with horrible clarity. I haven't reversed the levers, I've pushed them forward. The gray deepens first. That palpitating murk outside the frame grows darker, denser, and then, impossibly, the pulse of days returns. Night, day, but slower now, much slower. I watch the sun arc across the sky in what should be a continuous smear of light and instead resolves into something I can actually track. A burning stone dragged across a black ceiling. The alternations slow further. A single day stretches, becomes an hour of my time, then two, then something that feels like a week compressed into a single heartbeat. I can't look away. The sun stops setting in the east. I notice it gradually, the way you notice a sound has stopped only after the silence has already settled around you. It rises and falls in the west now, and with each cycle that I can still distinguish, it grows. Redder, larger, a coal that refuses to die but has forgotten how to burn properly. The moon is gone. I search for it and find nothing. The stars, those ancient fixed points that sailors trusted with their lives, that navigators carved into brass instruments and called truth, they slow, wheel, stop, become merely there like holes punched through dark fabric, and then even that movement ceases. The sun sits on the horizon, enormous, red as a forge, red as blood in lamplight. It doesn't rise, it doesn't set. It simply exists at the edge of the world, a vast hemisphere of dull, sullen heat, occasionally dimming, a momentary extinction. Like a dying man's breath before recovering to that same angry, exhausted glow. I understand what I'm seeing, tidal drag, the same force that already holds our moon in lockstep with the Earth, one face always toward us, one face always away, has now done the same to Earth itself. The planet has wound down, stopped rotating. One hemisphere bakes in eternal noon, the other freezes in eternal midnight. I am at the edge between them. I reverse the levers with extreme care. Slower. The dial hands decelerate from their frantic sweep to a crawl, and through the shimmer of the machine's oscillation, shapes begin to solidify. A beach, dark rock, I stop. The silence lands on me like a physical weight. No wind, no birds, no distant machinery, no voices, no proof that the word alive has any remaining currency in this world. I sit on the saddle and simply look. The sky is wrong in every direction simultaneously. To the northeast. Absolute black, a darkness so complete it has texture, and against it pale stars burn with a cold, unwavering intensity. Overhead, deep Indian red, starless. To To the southeast, the sky brightens to a scarlet glare where the sun's massive hull rests against the horizon, motionless and huge and indifferent. The rocks around me are the color of dried blood, and covering every southeast-facing surface, every ridge and ledge and crevice turned toward the dying sun, an intense, almost violent green. Moss, lichen, the only living things that could survive here, organisms that evolved in permanent twilight that never needed more than this thin, exhausted light. The sea stretches southwest, no waves, no whitecaps, no wind to make them. Just a slow, almost imperceptible swell, an oily rise and fall, the deep ocean still breathing out of pure biological habit, still moving because it has always moved. Along the waterline, a thick crust of salt, pink in the lurid light. I pull in a breath and my lungs immediately register the problem. Thin, too thin, the air is rarefied up here, or rather it has become rarefied. I know the feeling from a single alpine expedition years ago, a foolish afternoon on a mountainside that left me dizzy and gasping. My lungs work harder for less. My thoughts feel slightly delayed, like messages sent by telegraph with interference on the line. Then I hear the scream. Hard. Dissonant, a sound with no warmth in it whatsoever. My head snaps up and I see it, enormous, white, vaguely wing-shaped, a thing that moves like a butterfly but carries none of a butterfly's grace. It rises from the desolate slope above me in a slanting, fluttering arc, circles once against the scarlet sky and drops behind a ridge of hillocks. Gone, I become very still. I am listening now in a way I haven't listened since childhood, when the dark of a room demanded complete attention. Something is moving to my left. I turn my head slowly. What I took for a reddish boulder 10 feet away, maybe less, is not a boulder. Boulders don't move. This moves, slowly, deliberately, with the unmistakable mechanical confidence of something that is accustomed to being the largest creature in its environment. My mind tries to build a frame of reference for it and fails. A crab, that's the closest word I have. But a crab as large as a dining table. A crab whose armored carapace is corrugated and lumped with ungainly protrusions, patched with greenish growth. A crab with legs, how many legs, moving with hideous, unhurried purpose across the rock. Claws like the heads of sledgehammers, swaying as it walks. Antennae extending before it like carriage whips, sweeping the air, tasting distances. Eyes mounted on stalks, gleaming with something that might be perception, might be hunger. Might be both. Its mouth is moving. A complicated multi-part assemblage of palps and mandibles, flickering and testing as it approaches. I do not move. Something touches my cheek, light, delicate, like a thread of silk drawn across skin. I raise my hand to brush it away and it disappears, then returns immediately, and simultaneously something else grazes the edge of my ear. I slap at it reflexively, my fingers close around something thin and taut. It is pulled from my grip. A jolt of pure animal fear fires through my nervous system faster than thought. I spin. 6 inches from my face, another one, larger than the first, its antennae, one of which I have just seized and released, recoil back toward a body that is enormous, that smells of brine and ancient shell, and something else beneath that, something I don't have a name for. Its stalked eyes writhe and flex, repositioning, focusing on my face with an attention that communicates something unmistakable. Its claws descend, slick with algal slime, the size of my torso. My hand finds the lever. I have no memory of the decision. My body makes it before my mind has finished forming the sentence. I throw myself forward over the controls and shove the lever hard, and the machine convulses around me, and the beach goes gray and the crab dissolves into probability. I stop. 1 month forward. Same beach, there are dozens of them. I cannot adequately explain what this place does to a person. The mind requires a certain density of life, background noise, biological movement, the reassurance that the world is populated and continuous and ongoing. Strip that away and what replaces it isn't peace. It isn't calm, it's a specific, profound, existential horror. The red eastern sky pressing down, the northeast blackness absolute and final. The salt flat of that Dead Sea glittering pink. The rock beach churning slowly with those massive, ancient, purposeless crustaceans, moving in and out among the green lichen like machines running on the last of their fuel. The air thin enough to make every breath a minor negotiation with unconsciousness. I push forward 100 years. Same red sun, marginally larger, marginally dimmer. The same crabs, the same salt, the same dying sea. I push forward 1,000 years. Same. I stop checking each interval. I begin traveling in great leaps, 1,000 years at a stride, 10,000, dragged forward by something I can only describe as compulsion. The need to know, to witness the end of the equation. The sun continues its slow expansion, its slow cooling, spreading across the western sky like a bruise that will not resolve. 30 million years, I stop. The crabs are gone, the beach is still. Red rock and green lichen and nothing else, except now the lichen is flecked with white. I register the cold before I register what is causing it. The cold is immediate, the kind that finds the gaps in your clothing and inserts itself against your skin with surgical precision. Snow, white flakes turning in the thin air, eddying down with a silence that feels final. To the northeast, a pale hillside glitters, snow under starlight, pinkish-white, curved and low. Ice at the water's margin. Drifting plates of it further out, but the main body of the ocean, that salt-heavy ancient sea, bloody red in the permanent sunset, still moves, still liquid, still something. I scan the beach for motion. The machine's saddle creaks beneath me as I shift my weight, and the sound is so shockingly loud in this silence that my heart lurches. No animals, no insects. The green slime on the rock is the only biological evidence I can find. Even the vast, dim crab-like things that own this beach for tens of millions of years have exhausted whatever evolutionary thread kept them extant. A shallow sandbank breaks the sea surface nearby. I think I see something dark moving on it, flopping, spasmodically active, but when I focus on it directly, the movement stops. Rock, probably. The light is misleading. My oxygen-starved brain is manufacturing motion in the noise. I watch the sun. Its western edge does something I'm not expecting. A concavity appears, a small bite taken from the perfect arc of that enormous disk, a shadow creeping inward from the upper left limb with terrible geological patience. I stare at it for a long moment before my mind processes what I'm seeing. An eclipse, something passing between this earth and this dying sun, a silhouette moving across that vast red face. My first thought is the moon, but the moon is gone. Has been gone for longer than human civilization has existed. My second thought arrives slower but lands with more conviction. An inner planet, Mercury perhaps, or something that was once Mercury. Something drawn close to the exhausted sun by the same slow tidal arithmetic that stole the Earth's rotation and sent the moon spinning off into the dark. The shadow grows, the temperature drops, not gradually in steps, each one sharper than the last. A wind picks up from the east. Cold and purposeful, and the snow thickens in the air, and the darkness advances across the sky with the indifference of a physical law. The beach disappears, the sea disappears. The red ridgeline of hills to the west disappears, peak by peak, each one swallowed by the advancing black, one after another like candle flames being snuffed in a row. The wind becomes a moan, and then total darkness. The sky absolutely, completely, perfectly black. Only the pale stars remain. Burning with that cold, unwavering intensity that I now understand is simply what stars look like when nothing atmospheric stands between you and their actual nature. The cold enters my marrow. That is the only accurate way to describe it. Not surface cold, not the cold of an open window in January, but deep cold, structural cold, the kind that makes you understand that warmth is not the default condition of the universe. Cold is. Warmth is the aberration. Warmth is what life wrests from physics through constant, exhausting effort. I can't breathe. My lungs seize against the thin, freezing air, and my vision blurs at the edges, and my body informs me urgently that this negotiation with the atmosphere is failing. I climb down from the machine on legs that barely answer. I stand on the beach of 30-million-year future Earth in total darkness, sick and dizzy, and pulling in shallow, useless breaths. And I think about the irony of surviving every crisis the time machine has thrown at me only to suffocate in the last seconds of the world's life. Then the eclipse ends. A line of red-hot light appears at the edge of the sun, a curve of dying fire, impossibly vivid against the black, and the beach assembles itself back from the darkness degree by degree. I look at the sandbank. The thing is there, moving. Definitely moving this time, no ambiguity. No oxygen-starved hallucination. Round, football-sized, perhaps larger, trailing something downward, tentacles or tendrils or the last evolutionary memory of tentacles. Moving against the blood-red water with fitful, hopping, purposeless energy. The last animal on Earth. Maybe my legs nearly go. The dizziness is complete now, a full-body dissolution, and I understand that if I lie down on this beach, I will not get up. Not because something will kill me, but because there is nothing left here capable of caring whether I live or die. That understanding is what moves me. I grip the brass housing of the machine, cold as iron in a winter river, and I haul myself back into the saddle with everything I have left. I find the lever, and I pull. Chapter 16, Reverse Trajectory. Home. I came back. That's the only way to describe it. One moment I was lost in the howling dark of deep time, and then I was returning. For a long time I must have been unconscious, slumped over the machine like a dead man. Then awareness crept back in, neuron by firing neuron. The strobing pulse of days and nights resumed its rhythm. The sun burned gold again. The sky bled back to blue. I dragged air into my lungs, and it felt like resurrection. The landscape rippled beneath me like a heat mirage, the contours of the earth breathing in and out across geological centuries. The dials on the console spun backward, the numbers unwound, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the shadows of buildings began to materialize through the blur. Victorian terraces, church spires. The the familiar geometry of London reassembling itself from the wreckage of time. When the million-year dial kissed zero, I eased back on the acceleration. The thousand's hand was retreating toward its origin point. The flicker of day and night decelerated fast, then slow, then slower still, until individual sunrises became distinguishable again, until I could see the color of specific skies, and then the walls of my laboratory closed around me like a familiar embrace. I reduced the mechanism to a crawl, careful, easy, almost there. That's when I noticed something strange. I told you about Mrs. Watch it, how when I'd first departed, before my velocity had climbed beyond comprehension, she had crossed the laboratory like a rocket, a human blur burning from one end of the room to the other. Now, threading back through that same sliver of time, I witnessed her again. Except everything was inverted. Every motion she made was its precise mirror image, running in perfect reverse. The far door swung open. She glided backward across the flagstone floor, smooth and silent, moving tail first through space like a figure in a film played wrong way round. She retreated through the door she had originally entered and simply ceased. The uncanny of it hit me somewhere deep in the chest. Time isn't a river, it's a recording. And I had just watched the same moment of a woman's life play backward and understood in my marrow what that actually meant. For one fraction of a second, I thought I glimpsed Eloi, a flash of a face, gone before I could be certain. Then I killed the mechanism. Silence, my laboratory, my workbenches, my tools and instruments precisely where I had left them, undisturbed, patient, waiting, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just witnessed the extinction of our species and the slow heat death of the world. I dismounted the machine. My legs gave out almost immediately. I grabbed the bench and held on. My hands were shaking, full-body tremors, the kind that start in your core and radiate outward until your teeth are rattling in your skull. I sat down on the bench and pressed my palms flat against the wood and breathed. Just breathed. 1 minute, 2, 5. Gradually the shaking subsided. The laboratory solidified around me. It was all there, every familiar stain on the workbench, every half-finished apparatus, every scattered note in my own handwriting. I could have been a man waking from a particularly vivid nightmare. I could have imagined all of it, except I'd set out from the southeast corner of the room. I could see the scuff marks where the machine's skids had rested on the flagstone. The machine now stood against the northwest wall, right where you saw it tonight, that displacement, that precise, measurable distance across a laboratory floor, represented the exact overland journey between my lawn and the marble pedestal of the White Sphinx. The same pedestal beneath which the Morlocks had cached my stolen machine in the hollow dark of 800,000 years from now. Physics doesn't lie. I stood there staring at the geometry of it for a long moment, then my mind simply stopped, went flat and gray and empty, like a dead signal. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually I moved. I limped through the passage toward the house, my heel still screaming from whatever I'd done to it in that subterranean darkness, and I felt utterly filthy. Grime worked into every crease of my skin, the stink of deep time embedded in my clothes. The Pall Mall Gazette was on the table by the door. I picked it up, checked the date with the desperate focus of a man verifying his own sanity. Today. I checked the clock on the mantel. Nearly 8 in the evening. Then I heard you, voices, the percussion of cutlery on china, the warm, unbearably ordinary sounds of dinner. I stood in the passage for a moment and couldn't move. I felt hollowed out, sick, weak in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Then the smell reached me, roasted meat, hot bread, something wholesome and real and aggressively present in time. I opened the door, you know the rest. I washed the centuries off my skin. I sat down at the table. I ate, and now I've told you everything. Chapter 17. The Traveler's Unbelievable Return. The room felt smaller than it used to. He said it quietly without preamble. I know this is impossible to believe, but for me the only impossible thing is that I'm standing here in this room with all of you trying to explain what happened. He looked at the medical man, held his gaze. Don't believe it, call it a lie, call it a fever dream I had in the workshop. Say I've been so obsessed with the trajectory of our species that I finally cracked and invented a story to contain it. Treat the whole thing as theater, as craft. He paused. But as a story, what do you make of it? He picked up his pipe, started tapping it against the iron bars of the grate, a nervous rhythm, unconscious probably, something the hands do when the mind has gone somewhere it can't bring the rest of the body. Silence settled over the room. Then, slowly, like a spell-breaking, chairs creaked, shoes scraped against carpet. The editor examined the dying ember of his sixth cigar. The journalist reached into his waistcoat for his watch. The medical man stared at our host with an expression I couldn't quite name, not disbelief, not belief, something in the gap between them. The editor stood, sighed, dropped a hand onto the time traveler's shoulder. What a waste, he said, that you're not a fiction writer. You don't believe me. Well, no, of course not. The time traveler looked around at all of us. Where are the matches? Someone passed them. He lit his pipe and spoke through the smoke, his voice quieter now. "To tell you the truth." He stopped, drew a long breath. "I barely believe it myself." He stared at something across the room, and yet, his eyes had found the flowers. They sat on the small table near the window, white, withered, wrong. Somehow the way a thing is wrong when it belongs to a different world than the one it's sitting in. He stared at them for a long moment, then turned his hand over and looked at his knuckles. The scars there were still pink, still healing. The medical man crossed to the lamp and bent over the flowers. "The gynoecium is unusual," he said. "I don't recognize the genus." The psychologist leaned forward, hand extended. The journalist snapped his watch shut. "It's nearly 1 o'clock. How are we getting home?" "Cabs at the station," the psychologist said, not looking up. "May I take one?" the medical man asked, reaching for the flowers. "No," the word came out fast, final. "Where did you actually get them?" the medical man asked. The time traveler pressed a hand to his forehead. When he spoke, it was slowly, carefully, like a man trying to cup water in his palms without losing a drop. "Weena gave them to me. She put them in my pocket. When I was there." He looked around the room and something shifted in his face, something close to panic. "It's going, all of it, this room, your faces, the smell of this fire, it's overriding everything. Did I build a time machine? Did I build a model of one, or is it?" He stopped. "They say life is a dream, maybe, but I can't survive another dream that contradicts the last one. I need to see it." He grabbed the lamp off the mantel. We followed him down the corridor. There, the lamplight found it first, a squat, asymmetric mass of brass and ebony and ivory and quartz, crouching in the middle of the workshop floor like something that had no business existing. I reached out and touched the rail, cold, solid, real. There were brown smears across the ivory, grass and moss packed into the lower joints. One rail bent at a wrong angle, as if it had been forced, as if it had hit something, or something had hit it. The time traveler set the lamp on the bench, ran his hands slowly along the damaged rail, exhaled. "It's real," he said quietly, to himself as much as to us. "It's all real. I'm sorry for dragging you in here." We filed back to the smoking room in silence. He helped the editor into his coat at the door. The medical man paused and told him with practiced gentleness that he was suffering from overwork. The time traveler laughed, loud and genuine and slightly unhinged. I remember him framed in the open doorway, lamplight behind him, calling goodnight into the dark. I shared a cab with the editor. He called it a magnificent lie and meant it as a compliment. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and turned the evening over and over in my mind, the flowers, the scars, the look on his face when the memory started slipping. The story had been too strange to believe, but he had been too sober to dismiss. Every instinct I had was firing in opposite directions at once, and by 3 in the morning I'd made a decision. I was going back. The next day I arrived to find him already in the laboratory, except the laboratory was empty. I stood in the doorway and looked at the time machine for a long moment. Then, I don't know why, some impulse, I reached out and touched the lever. The whole machine swayed, lightly, disturbingly, like something huge made of almost nothing. A galleon that could be moved by a breath. I pulled my hand back fast, the way you do when you reach for something and the ground isn't where you expected it to be. I found him in the smoking room a few minutes later. He was coming in from outside, a small camera tucked under one arm and a knapsack under the other. He grinned when he saw me, gave me his elbow to shake, his hands were full. "Terribly busy," he said. "I know why you're here, it means a lot." He glanced toward the corridor. "Give me 30 minutes, stay for lunch. I'll prove every word, specimens, photographs, everything. You'll have no choice but to believe it." His eyes were bright, present, certain. "Forgive me." I told him yes. I didn't fully understand what he was going to do in those 30 minutes. I didn't let myself think about it too directly. I sat in the chair, picked up a paper, and tried to read. I remembered, suddenly, that I had promised to meet Richardson, the publisher, at 2 o'clock. I looked at my watch. If I left now, I'd barely make it. I walked down the corridor to let him know. I put my hand on the laboratory door. From inside, a short, truncated cry. Not a scream, more like surprise, cut off at the source. Then a mechanical click, a solid thud. I opened the door. A gust of air hit me hard, directional, like something had displaced it in a hurry. I heard glass hit the floor in pieces. I looked up and saw the skylight, one pane, shattered, daylight punching through. The time traveler was not there. For a fraction of a second less, I thought I saw something. A shape, translucent, almost vaporous, seated at the machine's controls, surrounded by a spiraling blur of black and brass, here and gone so fast I couldn't swear it wasn't the light. The time machine was gone. The floor was empty. The bench still held its spread of technical drawings. Dust was settling slowly, that was all. I stood there. The garden door opened behind me. The manservant appeared. We looked at each other across the empty room. "Has he?" I started. "Did he come out this way?" "No, sir, no one's come through. I was expecting to find him here." And just like that I understood. I didn't go to meet Richardson. I waited, all afternoon, into the evening. I told myself he'd be back any minute, that this was the proof he'd promised, the demonstration, and soon he'd rematerialize in that same cloud of displaced air and hold up his specimens and say, "There, you see, I told you." I'm still waiting. That was 3 years ago. And everyone knows now, anyone who ever knew him knows he has never come back. Chapter 18, Vast ignorance remains the question won't leave me alone. Will he come back? I've turned it over 1,000 times, standing at the window of this smoke-choked London evening, watching the gas lamps flicker to life one by one. The city breathes around me, coal smoke and horse dung and the distant thunder of the ironworks, and I keep thinking about where he is. When he is. Maybe he's gone backward, millions of years backward. Maybe right now he's choking on Cretaceous air so thick with oxygen it would make a modern man drunk, watching something enormous and ancient drag itself through a primordial sea. Maybe he crashed his machine into an oolitic reef while some long-necked horror circled beneath the surface, patient as time itself. Maybe the age of unpolished stone ended him, a flint edge across his throat before he could even engage the return lever. I can't think about that for too long. I won't. The alternative is that he went forward, not as far as he eventually went, not to that dying red world at the edge of everything, somewhere closer. Somewhere still recognizably ours, but with the answers we haven't earned yet. The riddles of governance, of suffering, of why we build and build and build only to watch it rot. God, I hope he went there, though he wouldn't have, not willingly. I remember the argument we had, 4 of us around his fireplace. The machine still just blueprints and brass fittings on his workbench, when Philby asked whether history was progressing or simply accumulating. He'd laughed at that particular laugh of his, sharp and a little cruel. Accumulating, he'd said, like garbage. He believed it, genuinely believed that civilization was a structural joke, that the higher we stacked it, the more inevitable the collapse. That every cathedral and parliament and gaslit boulevard was just the setup for a punchline written in ruin. He'd seen something in the equations of his machine, something in the mathematics of time as a physical dimension, that convinced him humanity's story had a shape and the shape was a wave that breaks. I don't accept that. I refuse to. If he's right, then we live as though he's wrong. We build anyway. We reach anyway. What else is there? But I won't pretend I'm not afraid. The future sits in my mind like a room with the lights off. Vast, unreadable. He gave me glimpses, his words across that dinner table, his voice raw with exhaustion and wonder, but they are fragmentary, unreliable, a handful of candles in an enormous dark. What I do have is solid, measurable, real, 2 flowers. I keep them on my desk. They're pressed flat now, brown at the edges, brittle as old paper. They barely look like flowers at all anymore. But they came from 800,000 years from now. They came from the hand of a creature who had every reason to fear him and chose instead to trust him. Chose tenderness over terror. Chose to give something small and living into the keeping of a stranger from an incomprehensible distance. When everything else had eroded, language, architecture, the vast accumulated weight of everything we'd ever built, that remained. I pick one up, hold it carefully, feel how light it is. Even at the end, it turns out we were still capable of this. That has to mean something. It has to. You have been listening to H.G. Wells' Time Machine, written by E.K. Stewart, narrated by Danny, our AI assistant.